An old black veteran, known in his small town as Sarge, steps into a biker bar with a quiet but undeniable presence. The bar, dominated by the notorious Hellfangs MC, turns silent. He's there for a reason: justice. But when words turn into fists and past secrets unfold, what follows is an explosive series of events that no one, especially the bikers, saw coming. By the end of this night, respect, brotherhood, and survival will be redefined. The bar smelled of stale beer, gasoline, and bad decisions. The kind of place where trouble didn't just brew, it simmered, boiled, and exploded. Neon lights flickered above the warped wooden counter, casting jagged shadows over the rough crowd that called this dive home. A lone figure stepped inside, his presence disrupting the usual symphony of low voices, laughter, and the occasional bar brawl. The moment he crossed the threshold, conversation halted. The air grew dense. Heads turned, eyes narrowing. The man was old, but something about him, perhaps the squared shoulders, the way he carried himself, or the storm in his eyes, kept anyone from dismissing him outright. He wasn't just any old man. He was Sarge. A leather-clad biker leaned against the bar, a sneer curling across his lips. "Well, well, look what we got here, boys. Granddaddy lost his way from the retirement home?" Laughter rippled through the room. Sarge didn't react. He walked to the counter, slow but steady, the creak of his boots against the wooden floor the only sound in the silence that followed. The bartender, a wiry, tattooed man with a scar running down his cheek, folded his arms. "We don't serve folks like you here, old-timer." Sarge turned his gaze to him, dark and unflinching. "A whiskey. Neat." The bartender chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Think your hearing's going, old man. I said we don't serve your kind." Sarge exhaled slowly, as if he'd expected this. "Didn't come here for the hospitality." He pulled a photo from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Looking for someone. My nephew. Name's Damon. He was last seen in this dump." A few of the bikers exchanged glances. The laughter died. The one who had mocked him first, big, burly, and sporting a thick, grizzled beard, snatched the photo and looked it over. "Never seen him," he said, tossing it back onto the counter. Sarge didn't blink. "You're lying." A few of the bikers straightened, sensing the shift in the air. The tension was thick, like a storm about to break. The bearded biker stepped closer, trying to tower over Sarge. "I think you got the wrong place, old man. Maybe you ought to walk your ass out of here before you get hurt." Sarge didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. The biker snarled and reached for him. Big mistake. Before anyone could register what happened, Sarge's hand shot out, grabbing the biker's wrist in an iron grip. A heartbeat later, he twisted, sending the man crashing onto a nearby table, beer mugs and liquor bottles shattering in the process. The room exploded into chaos. Two bikers lunged at him. Sarge moved like a machine, one sharp jab to the ribs, another to the jaw. A third man swung a pool cue. Sarge ducked, grabbed the cue midair, and used it to sweep the attacker's legs out from under him. The bartender reached under the counter, likely for a shotgun. Sarge flipped the pool cue around and hurled it like a spear. It smacked the bartender's hand, sending the gun skidding across the bar. Another biker swung a chair. Sarge sidestepped, yanked his arm, and threw him face first into the bar. A howl of pain followed as bottles shattered. More bikers surrounded him now, eyes burning with rage. Some hesitated, realizing the old man wasn't just lucky, he was trained. Others weren't so smart. A stocky man charged from behind. Sarge spun, grabbed the attacker's leather jacket, and flipped him over his shoulder with a force that made the floorboards groan. The man didn't get back up. Another brute stepped forward, twice Sarge's size, his fists clenched like wrecking balls. He threw a haymaker meant to break bones. Sarge ducked just in time. The momentum carried the biker forward, and Sarge capitalized, driving his elbow into the man's ribs before slamming his face into a nearby table. The biker crumpled. One by one, they fell. The bar was now littered with groaning bodies, overturned tables, and broken glass. The biggest biker of them all finally stood, the one who hadn't moved since Sarge walked in. Breaker, the Hellfangs leader. He clapped slowly, amused. "Well, goddamn," he said, stepping forward. "You're full of surprises, old man." The remaining bikers backed away, bruised, groaning, or too afraid to make another move. The air still crackled with tension, but now there was something else. Respect. Sarge turned to face Breaker, his knuckles bloodied but steady. "I came for my nephew, and I'm not leaving until I get some answers." Breaker smirked, wiping his mouth as if he had already tasted defeat. "Then maybe you and I need to have a drink." Sarge exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Whiskey. Neat. This time, the bartender didn't argue. Sarge sat down at the bar, his back straight, his eyes locked onto Breaker's. He had come for answers, and, one way or another, he was getting them. Breaker poured 2 drinks, sliding one toward Sarge. The rest of the bikers stood in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. Some whispered amongst themselves, others still groaned on the floor. Sarge picked up his glass but didn't drink. "Start talking." Breaker chuckled. "Man like you walks in here, handles himself like that, I gotta ask, who the hell are you?" Sarge didn't smile. "I told you, I'm a man looking for his nephew." Breaker leaned back against the bar. "You ain't just any man, though. You fight like someone who's seen real war." Sarge's gaze darkened. "Maybe I have." Breaker took a slow sip of his drink. "All right, old man. You want answers? You're about to get more than you bargained for." Sarge tightened his grip around his glass. The night was just beginning. Sarge sat across from Breaker, the Hellfangs leader, in the dimly lit bar. The remnants of the fight still lingered. Groaning bikers on the floor, broken furniture, and the unmistakable stench of spilled beer and blood. The bartender, keeping his distance, reluctantly poured 2 glasses of whiskey. This wasn't a social drink. This was an offering of war. Breaker leaned back against his chair, his leather vest marked with years of violence, his face unreadable. "You didn't come here just to break my boys in half, did you?" he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You're looking for someone." Sarge's fingers tightened around his whiskey. "Damon, my nephew." Breaker took a slow sip, his eyes watching Sarge carefully. "Never heard of him." Sarge's jaw tensed. He had seen enough liars in his lifetime to recognize one instantly. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of his stare do the talking. The bar, despite its wreckage, felt small, uncomfortably small. Breaker exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down. "Look, old man, I don't make it a habit of messing with family. If your nephew was around here, I'd tell you, but he ain't." "Liar." Sarge leaned forward slightly, his voice as calm as a blade sliding from its sheath. "You're lying to me." A few bikers stiffened, their hands twitching toward their knives or pistols. But Breaker raised a hand, a subtle order for them to stand down. His smirk flickered for just a second, an instant of hesitation. Then Sarge saw it. The tell. The way Breaker's fingers tapped against the table. A nervous tick. Sarge had interrogated enough men in his lifetime to recognize when someone was hiding something. And Breaker was hiding something. "You hesitated," Sarge said evenly. "That means you know something." Breaker chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He tossed back the rest of his drink and sighed. "Let's say I did hear something about a kid asking too many questions. A young guy, not from around here." Sarge's grip tightened. "Where is he?" Breaker hesitated again. "Thing is, he was asking about the wrong people. Not me. Not my guys." His fingers drummed on the table again. "There are some names I don't even like saying out loud, old man. And if your nephew got tangled up with them, he's already dead." Sarge's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen too many bodies to believe in ghosts, boy. Give me a name." Breaker exhaled. "The Vulture." The name landed like a bullet on the table between them. Sarge didn't react, but inside, something coiled tight. He had heard of the Vulture before, whispers of a man who ran the real crime in the city. The bikers were just foot soldiers. The Vulture was the warlord. Before Sarge could press further, there was a movement to his right. A younger biker, barely out of his 20s, had been inching closer during their conversation, one hand clenched around a hidden switchblade. Sarge's instincts took over. He moved before anyone else did, his chair scraping back as he caught the young biker's wrist mid-strike. A second later, Sarge twisted the arm at a brutal angle, forcing the kid to his knees. The bar went silent. The young biker gasped in pain, the knife clattering to the floor. Sarge held him there, his grip firm. "This how you treat your guests?" Breaker didn't react right away. Then he sighed and rubbed his temple. "Damn it, kid." He looked at Sarge. "He's just eager. Let him go." Sarge hesitated, then released the biker. The kid scrambled backward, cradling his arm. Breaker shook his head. "You don't get it, old man. The Vulture isn't some gang leader. He's not some thug running drugs out of the back of a warehouse. He owns everything. The cops, the politicians, half the damn city. If your nephew got caught up with him, he's either working for him or he's in a ditch." Sarge downed the rest of his whiskey, the burn doing nothing to ease the rage simmering in his chest. "Then I guess I'll have to pay the Vulture a visit," he said. Breaker scoffed. "You're crazy." Sarge stood, adjusting his coat. "I've been called worse." Breaker watched him, his expression unreadable. "You want my advice? Walk away. This isn't your fight." Sarge met his gaze. "It is now." He turned and walked out of the bar, the scent of blood and whiskey following him into the cold night. Sarge didn't go far. He leaned against his truck, his mind churning through what had just happened. He didn't trust Breaker, but he believed one thing. Damon had gotten involved with something big, bigger than a gang, bigger than drugs, and that meant time was running out. A sharp knock on his window snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned, finding a figure standing beside his truck. A woman, mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket and looking every bit as out of place in this part of town as he was. "Hell of a show back there," she said. "You made quite the impression." Sarge studied her, saying nothing. She sighed. "You don't know me, but I know you. Or at least, I know what you're after. If you're serious about finding your nephew, you're going to need help." Sarge narrowed his eyes. "And you just happen to be here?" She smirked. "Let's just say I keep an eye on these types. And I don't like the Vulture any more than you do." Sarge crossed his arms. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Call me Riley." Sarge didn't trust her, not yet, but something told him he was going to need all the help he could get. Riley leaned against the truck. "If you're going after the Vulture, you're going to need more than just an old man's fists." Sarge smirked. "Good thing I know how to handle more than just fists." She gave him a knowing look. "Then let's get started." Sarge glanced back at the bar one last time, the neon sign flickering. The night had started with a simple search for his nephew. Now it was a full-blown war, and Sarge was ready for it. Sarge drove through the dimly lit streets, his fingers tight around the wheel. Riley sat in the passenger seat, her expression unreadable. The night air was thick with tension, the weight of Breaker's words still pressing against his mind. Damon had been asking the wrong questions. And now he was missing. Sarge didn't believe in coincidence. If his nephew had gone looking for trouble, he had found it. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a series of abandoned buildings and rusted-out shipping containers stacked like tombstones. This was the last place Damon had been seen. Riley pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket and handed it to Sarge. "This is the address. It used to be a storage facility, but the wrong kind of people started using it. Sarge glanced at the scribbled numbers, then back at the shadowy buildings. "And you know this how?" Riley smirked. "I have my ways." Sarge didn't push. He had worked with enough informants and underground contacts in his military days to know when someone had a past they weren't ready to share. Right now, all that mattered was finding Damon. He parked the truck a block away and killed the engine. Silence settled over them, broken only by the distant hum of the city. "Stay here," Sarge said. Riley scoffed. "Not a chance. You'll need backup." Sarge studied her for a moment. He had seen plenty of people talk tough before. Most of them ended up dead. But there was something in her eyes. Determination. Maybe even something personal. "Fine, but stay close," he said. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the warehouse. Sarge's trained eye took in the surroundings. 2 security cameras mounted near the entrance, though they looked inactive. A broken fence along the side. The faint glow of a cigarette from someone standing guard near the back. Sarge motioned for Riley to follow him as he took the long way around, keeping low. He reached into his coat, pulling out a combat knife, its blade glinting under the faint light of the moon. The guard barely had time to react before Sarge was on him. A swift strike to the neck silenced him before he could call out. Sarge caught the man's weight and lowered him quietly to the ground. Riley raised an eyebrow. "Efficient." Sarge wiped the blade clean. No time for messy. They slipped inside the warehouse, moving through the dark corridors lined with crates and machinery left to rot. The air was thick with the smell of oil and something else, something worse, a faint metallic scent. Blood. Sarge signaled for Riley to stop as he crouched, listening. Voices echoed from deeper inside, rough and low. He moved forward, pressing against a stack of crates and peering around the corner. 3 men stood near a table, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were laughing about something, but Sarge's focus was on what lay in front of them. A chair. A metal chair, its arms covered in dried blood. His stomach turned. Damon had been here. But was he still alive? Riley whispered, "What's the play?" Sarge studied the men, too many to take down quietly. A distraction was needed. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a coin, and flicked it toward the far end of the warehouse. The small clink echoed, drawing the men's attention. The moment one of them moved to investigate, Sarge struck. He moved like a shadow, grabbing the nearest man in a chokehold and dragging him back into the darkness. The others barely had time to react before Sarge was on them. He drove his fist into one man's ribs, then turned and slammed his elbow into the third's jaw. Riley grabbed a pipe from the ground and swung hard, knocking out the last one. Breathing heavily, she turned to Sarge. "Remind me not to get on your bad side." Sarge ignored the comment and focused on the blood-stained chair. He knelt beside it, running a hand over the dried stains. Too old. A day, maybe more. He spotted something in the corner. A discarded jacket. Damon's. Sarge clenched his fists. He was close. Before he could inspect further, footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. More men. Too many this time. "We need to go," Riley urged. Sarge knew she was right. They had found a clue, but staying would get them killed. As they slipped out the side exit, Sarge took one last glance at the room. Whoever had taken Damon hadn't been sloppy. They had moved him, hidden the evidence. But they had left something behind. Fear. Fear in the way the guards had spoken, in the nervous glances they had exchanged. Whoever was behind this wasn't just a gang. They were something worse. Back in the truck, Sarge stared at Damon's jacket, running his fingers over the fabric. It was torn at the sleeve, a small blood stain near the collar. Riley watched him. "What now?" Sarge didn't look at her. His mind was already working through the next steps. They moved him. Someone higher up gave the order. Riley exhaled, shaking her head. "If the Vulture is involved, this won't be easy." Sarge turned to her, his expression hard. Nothing worth doing ever is. Riley hesitated. You ever lost someone before? Sarge's grip on the jacket tightened, but he said nothing. She nodded, as if she already knew the answer. Then, you know what's coming. This isn't just a search anymore. It's a war. Sarge started the engine. Then let's get ready for one. As they pulled away from the warehouse, neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the rooftop above. A shadowed figure, barely visible against the night sky, lowered a radio to his mouth. He found the warehouse, the voice said. He's not stopping. A pause. Then a reply crackled through the speaker. Let him come. Sarge drove in silence, the city lights bleeding into the night as he put distance between himself and the warehouse. Riley sat beside him, staring out the window, lost in thought. The jacket in Sarge's lap felt heavier than it should have. Damon's jacket, the only piece of him left behind. The weight of it wasn't just physical. It was a promise. He turned down an empty street, the familiar roads leading him somewhere he hadn't been in years, somewhere he thought he'd never have to return. The home of an old friend. Benny. Benny had been a soldier once, like Sarge. They had fought together in places most people only saw in nightmares. When the war ended, Benny had traded his uniform for a badge, joining the police force, trying to do some good. But Sarge knew better. There was no such thing as after the war. The battle never truly ended. It just changed its rules. Sarge pulled up in front of a small, run-down house. The porch light flickered, the paint peeling from the walls. He killed the engine and turned to Riley. Stay in the truck. She raised an eyebrow. You really think I'm just going to sit here? Sarge sighed. Benny doesn't like strangers. Riley smirked. I'm not a stranger. I'm your partner, remember? Sarge didn't respond. He just climbed out of the truck and walked up to the front door. He knocked once, twice. The door creaked open an inch and a shotgun barrel peeked through the gap. A familiar, gravelly voice followed. You got 2 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't blow your damn head off. Sarge smirked. That any way to greet an old friend? The shotgun lowered and the door swung open. Benny stood there, grayer, rougher, but still the same. He eyed Sarge up and down before shaking his head. Jesus, I thought you were dead. Sarge stepped inside. Not yet. Benny's house was cluttered but clean. Stacks of old case files sitting on the coffee table. Empty whiskey glasses on the counter. A man who had tried to retire but never really could. You showing up like this means trouble, Benny said, walking into the kitchen. He poured himself a drink and gestured toward the bottle. Want one? Sarge shook his head. Need a clear head. Benny scoffed. Same old Sarge. He took a sip and leaned against the counter. All right, let's hear it. Sarge pulled Damon's jacket from under his arm and tossed it onto the table. My nephew's missing. Benny glanced at the jacket, his expression shifting slightly. Damon, haven't seen him in years. He was looking into something. Got himself mixed up with a gang called the Hellfangs. Benny let out a slow breath. Hellfangs are bad, but they're not the worst of it. Sarge nodded. I know. Someone bigger's pulling the strings. A name came up. The Vulture. Benny's face darkened. Jesus, Sarge, you really know how to pick your fights. So, you've heard of him. Benny chuckled bitterly. Everyone in law enforcement has. The Vulture isn't just some gangster. He's an institution. He owns judges, cops, politicians. You don't go after him unless you got a death wish. Sarge's jaw tightened. Damon's caught up in it. That makes it my problem. Benny rubbed a hand over his face. Sarge, listen to me. I know what revenge feels like, but this isn't a war zone. This is the kind of fight you don't win. Sarge stepped closer. That's where you're wrong. Finally, Benny sighed. I don't have much, but I've got some files. Unofficial ones. Cop records never touch the Vulture, But people like me, we keep our own records." He walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "This is everything I have." Sarge flipped through the pages. Names, addresses, photos. Most of them were marked with red X's. People who had disappeared. People who had gotten too close. Benny lowered his voice. "If the Vulture has Damon, there's one place you should check. An old nightclub downtown, but it's just a front. Word is, that's where they move people they don't want found." Sarge nodded. "Then that's where I start." Benny exhaled, shaking his head. "You never change, do you?" Sarge smirked. "Didn't get this old by playing it safe." Benny chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Just watch your back, Sarge." Sarge clapped him on the shoulder. "Always." Back in the truck, Riley eyed the folder in Sarge's hands. "That look like what we need?" Sarge didn't answer right away. He flipped through a few more pages, then set the file down. "It's a start." Riley tapped her fingers against the dashboard. "So, what's the plan?" Sarge started the engine. "We pay a visit to that nightclub." Riley gave a low whistle. "We're going straight into the hornet's nest, huh?" Sarge pulled onto the road. "Only way to catch the queen." As they drove, Riley glanced at him. "You and Benny go way back?" Sarge nodded. "Since the war." She hesitated before asking, "You trust him?" Sarge kept his eyes on the road. Trust is a tricky thing, but Benny's always been a straight shooter. They drove in silence for a few moments, the weight of what lay ahead settling between them. Across town, Benny sat at his desk, staring at a single name in the file he had given Sarge. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. When the line picked up, a voice on the other end spoke. Cold. Professional. "Tell me you're not stupid enough to get involved," the voice said. Benny closed his eyes. "Sarge is coming." A long pause. Then he's already dead. The city streets felt different at night, quieter but only on the surface. Beneath the hum of distant traffic there was a heartbeat, a pulse of unseen danger lurking in the shadows. Sarge knew it well. He had walked streets like these in cities halfway across the world, where silence was just a mask for chaos underneath. But this wasn't a foreign war zone. This was home, and someone had taken his nephew. The truck rolled to a stop in a desolate alley tucked between two decaying apartment buildings. The address Benny had given them led here, to a dive bar called Lynch's Den. It wasn't the kind of place tourists stumbled into. It was the kind of place people disappeared from. Riley checked the magazine of her pistol, then tucked it back into her jacket. "You sure about this guy?" Sarge pushed open the door and stepped out. "No, but I don't have time to be careful." The neon sign above the entrance flickered, half the letters burned out, making the word Lynch stand alone in a sickly glow. Sarge took that as a bad omen. They entered through a side door, slipping past the main crowd. The inside was what he expected. Smoke-stained walls, a few lowlifes nursing cheap whiskey, and a jukebox playing a song nobody was really listening to. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, old beer, and lies. A heavy-set man with tattooed arms sat at the corner booth, fingers lazily tapping against the table. Lynch, an informant, a survivor, a man who knew things others didn't. Sarge slid into the booth across from him, Riley standing close behind. Lynch didn't even look up. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Sarge leaned forward. "Then you know why I'm here." Lynch smirked, finally meeting his gaze. "Damon, right? Yeah. Word is he was asking too many questions. Now, you're doing the same." Sarge's patience was thin. "I don't have time for games." Lynch chuckled, taking a sip from his glass. "See, that's the thing. Information? It's expensive. And you? You just walked into my place like you own it." Sarge grabbed his wrist and slammed it against the table. The bar turned silent. "Damon," Sarge said evenly. "Tell me everything." Lynch winced but didn't fight. "Fine, I'll give you a name. The vulture didn't take your nephew, not directly. The one who grabbed him? His name's Cortez." Sarge narrowed his eyes. "Who is he?" Lynch licked his lips. "An enforcer, one of the vulture's top guys. He's the one they send when they want someone to disappear." Sarge's grip tightened. "Where do I find him?" Lynch hesitated. "Look, man, you really don't want to." Sarge's hand twitched toward his knife. Lynch sighed. All right. There's an old boxing gym in Southside. It's a front. That's where he operates." Sarge stood up. "If you're lying—" "I ain't." Lynch rubbed his wrist. "But you better move fast. If Cortez has your nephew, the clock's already running out." The gym was one of those places that had seen better days. Rusted chain-link fences, broken streetlights, and an old sign barely hanging on. The windows were covered in grime, the inside glowing dimly under flickering fluorescence. Sarge and Riley approached from the alley, moving with purpose. Two men stood by the entrance, cigarettes dangling from their lips. They barely had time to react before Sarge grabbed one by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Riley took care of the second, a quick strike to the throat dropping him to his knees. Inside, the smell of sweat and stale air hit them like a wall. A makeshift ring sat in the middle, surrounded by men placing bets on a bare-knuckle fight. And standing at the far end, watching with cold amusement, was Cortez. He was built like a brawler, thick arms covered in scars, a jagged grin splitting his face. He saw Sarge the moment he walked in and laughed. Well, Cortez said, cracking his knuckles. "Looks like we got an old dog sniffing around places he shouldn't be." Sarge didn't blink. "Where's Damon?" Cortez tilted his head. "Now, why would I tell you that?" Sarge stepped forward. "Because if you don't, I'll break every bone in your body until you do." Cortez's men circled them, the tension thick enough to choke on. But Sarge wasn't worried. He had been in worse situations. He had fought men twice as mean, twice as dangerous, and he had survived. Cortez grinned. "Tell you what, old man, you beat me? I'll tell you where the kid is." He raised his fists. "But you won't." Sarge rolled his shoulders. "Let's find out." The fight was brutal. Cortez was younger, faster, and strong as hell. His punches came in heavy, each one capable of breaking a lesser man. But Sarge wasn't a lesser man. He dodged, countered, took a few hits but gave worse in return. The crowd roared as fists met flesh, as blood hit the floor. But Sarge never lost focus. A well-timed elbow to the ribs, a sharp jab to the throat, and finally a devastating right hook that sent Cortez crashing to the floor. The room went silent. Sarge knelt beside him. "Where is Damon?" Cortez coughed, blood staining his teeth. He grinned through the pain. "Too late." He chuckled. They moved him. Sarge's stomach tightened. "Where?" Cortez groaned, shaking his head. "You don't get it. You're playing in the big leagues now. The vulture knows you're coming, and he's ready." Sarge's fists clenched. He could feel Riley watching, waiting for his move. Cortez spat blood and smirked. "You think you're hunting him?" He chuckled darkly. "He's hunting you." As they left the gym, Riley exhaled sharply. "So now what?" Sarge wiped the blood from his knuckles, his jaw set. "Now we find out where they took Damon." Riley gave him a sideways glance. "And how do we do that?" Sarge looked down at Cortez's phone, which he had taken from his pocket. "We make a call." The night was far from over, and the real fight had just begun. The underground fight club wasn't listed anywhere. No signs, no advertisements, just whispers in dark alleys, passed between men who thrived in blood and brutality. If Sarge wanted to get close to the vulture's operation, he needed to be on the inside, and the only way in was through violence. Riley parked a block away from the warehouse that served as the club's entrance. It looked abandoned, but the heavy-set men standing by the door told a different story. "You sure about this?" she asked, eyeing the guards. "This could get ugly." Sarge cracked his knuckles. It was ugly the moment they took Damon. He stepped out, walking toward the entrance with the kind of confidence that made men hesitate. The guards squared their shoulders, but one of them recognized something in Sarge's eyes. Something dangerous. "You got an invite?" the bigger one asked. Sarge didn't stop walking. "I'm here to fight." The guards exchanged glances before stepping aside. The door creaked open, revealing a world of sweat, smoke, and blood. Inside, men surrounded a cage in the center of the warehouse, their roars of approval echoing as two fighters battered each other senseless. The floor was slick with sweat and blood, the air thick with the scent of adrenaline. Sarge pushed through the crowd until he found the man running the bets, a bald, scarred man with tattoos running down his arms. Kane, the Vulture's fight organizer. "I want in," Sarge said. Kane glanced at him, unimpressed. "You? Too old?" Sarge grabbed the nearest man, slammed his head against the metal cage, and let him crumple to the floor. Kane raised an eyebrow. "All right, you're in." The first fight was fast. Too fast. Sarge had been expecting a challenge, but the thug they threw at him barely lasted a minute. A few quick blows and he was out cold. The second was tougher. A wiry man with quick hands, dodging like a ghost. Sarge let him get cocky, let him dance. Then he grabbed him mid-dodge and slammed him face first into the cage. The crowd loved it. By the fourth fight, Sarge was drenched in sweat, his knuckles bloody, his breath coming in sharp bursts. But he wasn't done, not until he had what he came for. Then Kane called for silence. "We got a special treat tonight," he announced. "New guy's been tearing through fighters like a damn machine. Let's see how he does against Red." The crowd erupted. Sarge frowned. He had heard the name before. Red wasn't just a fighter. He was the Vulture's personal enforcer, a man who left nothing but broken bodies behind. The cage door opened, and a towering figure stepped inside. Red was a mountain of a man, covered in scars, his knuckles wrapped in tape already stained with blood. He grinned at Sarge. "Been a long time since I had a real fight." Sarge rolled his shoulders. "Then let's not waste time." Red hit like a freight train. The first punch sent Sarge stumbling, pain exploding across his ribs. He barely had time to block the second before Red drove a knee into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. Sarge staggered but didn't fall. He had fought men like this before, brawlers, tanks, men who thought they were invincible. Sarge ducked under the next swing, stepping in close. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a jab to the throat, a kick to the knee. Red grunted but barely budged. He grinned through the pain. Then he grabbed Sarge by the throat and lifted him off the ground. For a moment, the world blurred. Then Sarge's back slammed against the metal cage, the impact rattling his bones. The crowd roared. Riley was shouting something from the sidelines, but Sarge couldn't hear it. He was focused on one thing: surviving. Red dragged him up, throwing another punch. This one meant to break something. Sarge twisted at the last second, letting the hit glance off his shoulder. Then he retaliated. A headbutt. It caught Red off guard, making him stumble. Sarge pressed the advantage. He struck fast, hammering blows to the gut, the ribs, the throat. Red swung wildly, missing more than he hit. Then Sarge saw his opening. A brutal right hook. Red's head snapped back. He staggered, and then he fell. The warehouse erupted. Sarge leaned against the cage, breathing hard, blood dripping down his face. He had won. Kane nodded approvingly. "You're full of surprises, old man." Sarge wiped the blood from his mouth. "I want to meet the Vulture." Kane chuckled. "You don't meet the Vulture. He meets you." Sarge smirked. "Then tell him I'm coming." Outside, Riley helped Sarge into the truck. "Jesus, you look like hell." Sarge winced. "Feel like it too." She pulled out a med kit. Was it worth it? Sarge nodded, pulling a small slip of paper from his pocket. Got an address? Riley raised an eyebrow. What's there? Sarge stared out the window. The Vulture's next move. In a dark office, far from the fight club, a phone buzzed. A man picked it up. His voice was smooth, calculated. Go ahead. The voice on the other end was sharp. Sarge just beat Red. A long pause, then a quiet chuckle. Interesting. The man leaned back, exhaling a slow breath. Keep an eye on him, but don't kill him yet. Another pause. I want to see how far he'll go. A storm was brewing. Sarge had earned his place in the underground world. He had drawn the Vulture's attention, but with every step forward, the noose tightened. Red wouldn't forget this, and neither would the Vulture. Sarge gripped the steering wheel tighter as the truck rumbled down the empty highway. Riley sat beside him, double-checking the rounds in her pistol. The address Kane had slipped him led to the outskirts of town, an abandoned industrial site swallowed by darkness. It had taken days of hunting, but Sarge finally had a location. Damon was here. Or at least, he had been. The wind howled as they pulled up to the decaying warehouse. The place reeked of rust, oil, and something worse, something metallic and sharp. Blood. Sarge stepped out first, scanning the area. No guards at the entrance, no security cameras. It was too quiet. Riley unholstered her gun. I don't like this. Sarge nodded. Neither do I. They moved quickly, pressing their backs against the walls as they slipped inside through a broken side door. The interior was worse than the outside, dim lights flickering overhead, old machinery rusting in the corners. The air was heavy, suffocating. Then they heard it. A muffled groan. Sarge's heart pounded. He moved first, following the sound through a maze of steel beams and shattered glass. The noise led him to a small room at the back, its door slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Damon sat in the corner, tied to a chair, his face bloodied, one eye swollen shut. His breathing was shallow. Sarge stepped forward. Damon. Damon's head lifted, his gaze unfocused. Then recognition dawned. Uncle? The explosion of gunfire shattered the moment. Sarge dove, tackling Riley to the ground as bullets ripped through the walls. The ambush had been waiting for them. Men poured into the warehouse, their shadows stretching against the flickering lights. Sarge rolled, drawing his pistol and firing back. One of the attackers dropped, but more replaced him. Riley flipped a table for cover. They knew we were coming. Sarge gritted his teeth. Of course they did. The Vulture had been waiting for this. More bullets screamed past, sparking against metal beams. Sarge grabbed a nearby crate and shoved it over, forcing an attacker to stumble. Then he shot him in the leg, finishing him with a second round to the chest. Riley popped up, firing twice, taking down two more. Damon groaned. They moved me here 2 days ago. They were expecting you. Sarge's stomach tightened. The Vulture had played them. Then came the worst sound yet, the metallic click of a hammer being pulled back. Sarge turned, but it was too late. A gun barrel pressed against his skull. Drop it, a gravelly voice ordered. Sarge clenched his jaw but let his pistol clatter to the ground. Riley turned, but 3 more men had already flanked her, their rifles aimed at her chest. The ambush was complete. A figure emerged from the shadows. Cortez. His face was still swollen from their last fight, but his grin was all malice. Told you, he sneered. You think you're hunting the Vulture? You don't hunt him. He hunts you. Sarge said nothing. Cortez leaned down, grinning. The Vulture's real impressed with you. So impressed he wants to meet you personally. He nodded to his men. Then everything went black. Sarge woke to the sting of cold water splashing against his face. His head throbbed, his vision blurred. He tried to move, but his arms were bound behind his back, his legs tied to the chair beneath him. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of mold and gasoline. A single flickering bulb hung overhead, casting twisted shadows along the damp concrete walls. A low chuckle echoed. "You're finally awake." Sarge lifted his head. Across from him, Damon sat slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow but steady. Riley was tied to a chair beside him, her jaw clenched, eyes burning with defiance. And standing between them, Cortez. The enforcer cracked his knuckles. "Man, you really don't know when to quit, do you?" Sarge exhaled slowly. He was still gathering his bearings, but his mind was already working, analyzing the room, the exits, the number of guards outside. Cortez crouched beside him. "The vulture wants you alive, for now." He grinned. "Me, though? I think you need to learn a little respect." Sarge didn't react. Cortez drove a fist into his gut. The pain shot through his ribs like fire, but Sarge didn't make a sound. He had been hit worse, by stronger men, in worse places. Cortez laughed. "Tough guy, huh? That's good. I like a challenge." He raised his fist again. Then a loud bang erupted from outside. Cortez stiffened, turning toward the door. Another bang, then shouting. Sarge felt the energy shift. Something was happening. The guards outside were yelling, gunfire exploding in the distance. Cortez turned to his men. "Stay here. I'll handle this." The second he stepped outside, Sarge acted. He flexed his wrists, feeling the ropes rub against his skin. He had been working on loosening them since the moment he woke up. Now was his chance. With a sharp twist, he freed one hand, then the other. Riley saw him move and nodded. "Hurry." Sarge leaned down, untying his legs before moving to Damon. His nephew was weak, but alive. Riley kicked over a chair, grabbing the sharp edge of a broken pipe and sawing through her restraints. Sarge helped Damon to his feet. "Can you walk?" Damon groaned but nodded. "Barely." The gunfire outside intensified. Sarge grabbed a discarded pistol from the floor and checked the magazine. Half full. It would have to do. He moved toward the door and pressed his ear against it. Outside, Cortez was shouting. Someone was fighting his men. Sarge had no idea who, but he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. He turned to Riley. "We fight our way out." She grinned. "Thought you'd never say it." They burst through the door, guns blazing. The battle had just begun. Sarge pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, heart pounding as gunfire rattled the air. Muzzle flashes burst through the darkness, illuminating the chaos. Riley crouched beside him, gripping her pistol, her face smeared with grime. Damon leaned against a stack of crates, still weak but conscious. They had fought their way out of captivity, but the battle wasn't over. Not yet. "We need an exit," Riley whispered. Sarge peered around the corner. More of the vulture's men were flooding in, their boots echoing against the steel floors. They were pinned. Then the unexpected happened. A motorcycle roared outside. Then another. Gunfire erupted, not directed at them, but at the guards. Shadows moved in the distance, the low rumble of engines growing louder. Sarge frowned. He knew that sound. Bikers. And not just any bikers. The Hellfangs. The gunfire outside intensified, forcing the vulture's men to redirect their focus. Sarge didn't waste time. He grabbed Damon and motioned for Riley to follow. "Move, now!" They sprinted through the open corridor, weaving between metal beams and rusted-out machinery. Riley fired over her shoulder, dropping a man who had managed to reload. The exit was just ahead, an old loading dock with a metal staircase leading outside. As they reached the door, it burst open. Breaker stood there, his face unreadable under the glow of the streetlight. His leather jacket bore the Hellfangs insignia, the emblem of a gang that had once been Sarge's enemy. Now they were his only hope. "Didn't think you'd make it out alive," Breaker muttered. Sarge didn't have time for pleasantries. "Neither did I." Breaker motioned to the row of bikes lined up along the warehouse perimeter, his men already engaged in a firefight against the Vulture's enforcers. "Get on. We're leaving." Sarge hesitated. He didn't trust Breaker, but right now, trust didn't matter. He helped Damon onto one of the bikes while Riley hopped onto another. Sarge slid behind the handlebars of a third, gripping the throttle. Breaker revved his engine. "Follow me!" The tires screeched against the asphalt as they tore out of the lot, bullets ricocheting off the pavement. The Vulture's men scrambled to stop them, but the roar of engines drowned out their shouts. They sped into the night, leaving a war zone in their wake. The ride was long and silent. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion. Damon held on to Sarge weakly, his strength fading with each mile. Finally, Breaker led them to a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. A hideout. Sarge helped Damon inside and set him down on an old couch. Riley checked his wounds while Breaker poured himself a drink, watching them. After a long silence, Sarge finally spoke. "Why the rescue?" Breaker smirked. "I owed you one." Sarge narrowed his eyes. "I don't buy that." Breaker sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Fine, you're causing problems for the Vulture, and some of us don't like being under his thumb." Sarge's jaw tightened. "You're saying you want him gone?" Breaker chuckled. "I'm saying I wouldn't mind if someone took care of him." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "And I think you're just crazy enough to try." Sarge studied him. "What's your angle?" Breaker exhaled. "The Hellfangs weren't always lapdogs. We ran things our way before the Vulture took over. Now, we're just another branch of his empire. Some of us want out." Sarge scoffed. "And you think I'm your ticket to freedom?" Breaker shrugged. "I think you're the only one dumb enough to go up against him and actually stand a chance." Riley looked between them. "So, what's the play?" Breaker set his drink down. "The Vulture's expecting you to go in guns blazing. That's his game. You don't beat him by playing fair." Sarge leaned against the wall. "Then what do you suggest?" Breaker grinned. "We hit him where it hurts." Sarge raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" Breaker reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the table. Sarge unfolded it. A blueprint. A warehouse. Breaker pointed to a specific area. "Weapons. The Vulture's entire supply chain runs through this place. Take it, and you cripple his operations." Sarge exhaled. "That's not just an attack. That's war." Breaker's grin widened. "Exactly." Riley crossed her arms. "And what do we get in return?" Breaker leaned back. "You get Damon free and clear, and you get your shot at the Vulture." Sarge glanced at Damon, who was barely staying conscious. He looked at Riley. Then he looked at Breaker. After a long pause, he nodded. "Then we burn it down." Far away, in the heart of the city, the Vulture sat in a dimly lit room, listening to the reports coming in. Sarge had escaped. He leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Cortez stood nearby, still nursing a bruised jaw. "You want me to find him?" The Vulture smiled slightly. "No." Cortez frowned. "Sir." The Vulture took a slow sip of his drink. "He's coming to us. Let's not ruin the fun." Cortez nodded, though he didn't share the amusement. The Vulture set his glass down. "Let's see how far he's willing to go." Sarge stared at the blueprint on the table. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. The night outside was deep, the woods shrouded in a mist that felt thick with danger. No one spoke for a long time. Damon drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow but steady. Riley finally broke the silence. "We don't have much time." Sarge nodded. He had been in enough wars to know when the clock was ticking. We move at first light. Breaker smirked. This is gonna be fun. Sarge didn't smile. He only tightened his grip on the paper in front of him. It was time to take the fight to the vulture. No more running. No more hiding. This was war. The fire crackled in the dimly lit cabin, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Sarge, Riley, and Breaker stood over the blueprint, studying every detail of the vulture's weapons warehouse. It was more than just a storage facility. It was a fortress. Breaker tapped a finger against the map. The security's tight. Guards rotating every 4 hours, motion sensors along the perimeter, and a steel vault in the back where the real firepower is stored. Sarge exhaled slowly. And you want us to walk in there and take it? Breaker smirked. Not walk in. Break in. Riley crossed her arms. Sounds like a suicide mission. Breaker leaned back, tossing a knife in the air before catching it. Maybe, but if we pull it off, the vulture loses his best supply chain. His empire starts to crack. Sarge traced a route on the blueprint with his finger. We need a distraction, something to draw their attention away from the vault. Breaker nodded. I've got a few guys who can cause some trouble at the front gate. Light up a few cars, start a firefight. That should be enough to keep most of the guards busy. Riley raised an eyebrow. And what about the rest? Sarge cracked his knuckles. We'll handle them. The night was thick with tension. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a fortress of concrete and steel, lit by floodlights and patrolled by armed guards. Sarge adjusted his gear, checking his rifle before nodding to Riley and Breaker. A few miles away, Breaker's men were already moving. The first explosion came at exactly midnight. A car parked near the entrance erupted in flames, followed by a hail of gunfire. The guards scrambled toward the front, their attention diverted. Sarge, Riley, and Breaker moved in from the rear. The fence was their first obstacle. Sarge knelt, cutting through the wires with bolt cutters before slipping inside. Riley followed, then Breaker. They moved swiftly, keeping low to the ground, weaving between stacks of shipping containers. Ahead, 2 guards stood watch, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Sarge moved first. Before the guards could react, he had one in a chokehold, silencing him within seconds. Riley took down the second, her knife flashing in the moonlight. They dragged the bodies behind a container and pressed on. Breaker motioned toward the side entrance. Vaults through there. Sarge led the way, pressing against the metal door. Locked. Breaker pulled out a small explosive charge. Step back. A muffled boom sent a shockwave through the air. The door groaned, then fell open. Inside, rows of crates lined the room, each one marked with the vulture's insignia, the weapons cache. Sarge moved toward the steel vault at the back. He placed his hands against it, feeling its weight. It was reinforced. Breaker grinned. That's where the fun starts. Riley pulled out a second explosive, setting it against the hinges. This will make some noise. Sarge exhaled. Do it. The explosion ripped through the silence. The vault door twisted, its locks shattered. Then the alarms blared. Time's up, Breaker muttered. Footsteps thundered outside. Sarge grabbed a rifle from one of the crates, tossing another to Riley. Get ready. The first guard rushed in. Sarge dropped him with a single shot. The second followed, only to meet Breaker's knife. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the corridor, bullets shredding through the crates. Sarge dove behind cover, returning fire, dropping another 2 men. Riley crouched beside him, reloading. We need to move. Sarge scanned the warehouse. More guards were pouring in. The exit was blocked. Breaker growled. We're boxed in. Sarge's mind raced. There was one way out, but it wasn't subtle. He grabbed a grenade from one of the crates, pulled the pin, and lobbed it toward the fuel drums stacked in the corner. Cover your ears. The explosion was deafening. The blast tore through the room, sending flames roaring toward the ceiling. The force knocked back the guards, giving Sarge and the others the opening they needed. "Move!" They sprinted through the smoke, bullets whizzing past them. Sarge led the way, cutting through the chaos, shoving aside debris. Breaker shouted over the noise. "Bikes are outside!" They burst through the exit, emerging into the night. Then they saw him. Cortez. The enforcer stood near the parked motorcycles, his rifle aimed directly at them. Sarge didn't hesitate. He fired first. Cortez dodged, rolling behind cover. His men opened fire. Riley took down one, Breaker another. Sarge advanced, weaving between gunshots, his focus locked on Cortez. The two clashed, fists colliding, grappling for control. Cortez swung first, his punch grazing Sarge's jaw. Sarge retaliated with a brutal elbow to the ribs. Cortez staggered but recovered fast, tackling Sarge to the ground. They wrestled, each trying to gain the upper hand. Cortez grabbed a knife, slashing toward Sarge's throat. Sarge caught his wrist, twisting it violently. The knife fell. Sarge struck. A devastating punch sent Cortez sprawling. Riley fired the last shot, dropping the final guard. The night fell silent. Sarge stood over Cortez, panting. "Stay down." Cortez wiped blood from his mouth, grinning despite his injuries. "You think this matters?" He coughed. "The vulture knew you'd come." Sarge narrowed his eyes. Cortez chuckled. "You're playing right into his hands." Sarge didn't respond. He just raised his rifle. Breaker pulled him back. "Not now." Sarge hesitated, then lowered his weapon. They mounted their bikes. Engines roared. They rode into the darkness, flames rising behind them. The heist was over. The war had just begun. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and gasoline. Sarge stood by the truck, his hands resting on the hood, staring down the empty road. The adrenaline from the heist had worn off, leaving behind an ache deep in his bones. He had been in enough wars to know what came next. Retaliation. Riley and Breaker were inside the cabin, tending to Damon, who was still recovering. The heist had cost them. A few of Breaker's men had gone down, and the warehouse fire had spread faster than expected. The vulture would be bleeding from the loss, but bleeding animals were the most dangerous. Sarge's burner phone buzzed. He flipped it open. "Yeah?" The voice on the other end was grim. "It's Benny." Sarge's grip tightened. "What about him?" A long pause. Then, "He's dead." Sarge closed his eyes. Not Benny. The old cop had been one of the few men in this world Sarge trusted. A soldier once, like him. They had fought together, bled together. Benny had left the war, but the war had never left him. And now he was gone. Sarge exhaled slowly. "Where?" "The church on 5th. Funerals today." Sarge didn't say goodbye. He just hung up. The funeral was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight. Benny's coffin sat at the front of the small chapel, draped in the American flag. A handful of people filled the pews. Old cops, retired soldiers, men who had once walked the same path as Sarge and Benny. Sarge stood at the back, watching. A priest spoke soft words about sacrifice, duty, and honor. Sarge knew the truth. Benny hadn't died in the line of duty. He had been silenced. The Hellfangs had their ways of dealing with problems. The vulture had his own. Benny had known too much, helped the wrong people. He had helped Sarge, and now he was in a box. Riley stood beside him, her jaw tight, eyes dark with fury. This was a message. Sarge nodded. At the front, Benny's daughter, Claire, stood alone, her hands clenched in front of her. She was barely in her 20s, her face pale and hollow. She hadn't cried. Not yet. When the service ended, the men who had served with Benny shook her hand, mumbled their condolences. She nodded, but her eyes were empty. Then she saw Sarge. She walked straight toward him. "You did this." Her voice was sharp, brittle. Sarge didn't argue. You got him involved in something he had no business in. Her hands trembled. I told him to stay away. I told him you'd bring trouble. Sarge met her gaze. I didn't ask for his help. Claire's lip curled. And yet, here we are. She turned and walked away. Sarge let her go. He had nothing to say that would make it right. They left the funeral in silence. Back at the cabin, Breaker was waiting. His expression was unreadable as he leaned against his bike, arms crossed. "Heard about Benny," Breaker said. Sarge didn't respond. Breaker exhaled. "It's only going to get worse." Sarge knew that. He had always known that. Breaker motioned toward the woods. "Took a ride earlier. Found something you need to see." Sarge followed him. A few minutes into the trees, Breaker stopped. He pointed at a tree. Nailed to the bark was a knife, and beneath it, a message. "Turn back or die." Sarge pulled the knife free, studying the blade. It was sharp, new. A warning. Riley frowned. "The vulture doesn't scare that easy. Why would he warn us?" Breaker's face was grim. "Because he doesn't think this is a warning." Sarge nodded. "He thinks it's a courtesy." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Sarge turned. "No more warnings," he said. That night, the wind howled against the cabin. The flames in the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Sarge sat alone at the table, the knife still in his hand. Benny was dead. Claire hated him. The vulture was tightening the noose, and yet he felt something unexpected. Clarity. He had spent too long reacting, too long waiting for the next move. That was over. From now on, he dictated the terms. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Riley entered. "You need to see this." She handed him a phone. A video was playing. The footage was grainy, shaky, recorded in secret. It showed Benny tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloodied. A voice off camera spoke. "You should have stayed out of this." Then a gunshot. The screen went black. Sarge's grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. Riley watched him. This was sent to Claire. Whoever did it wanted her to know. Sarge set the phone down, his jaw clenched. Breaker leaned against the door frame. "We strike now." Sarge exhaled. "Not yet." Riley's eyes narrowed. "After that, you want to wait?" Sarge shook his head. "I want to finish this." He looked up. "No more half measures, no more warnings. We take the vulture apart, piece by piece." Breaker smirked. "Now you're talking." Sarge stood, rolling his shoulders. "Then let's get to work." Far across the city, in a dark office, the vulture sat at his desk. Cortez stood nearby, watching the video of Benny's execution on loop. "You think he got the message?" Cortez asked. The vulture smiled, swirling his drink. "He got it," he said, "but it's not about making him afraid." Cortez frowned. "Then what is it?" The vulture's smile widened. "It's about making him desperate." Sarge stood outside, staring up at the moonlit sky. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about war. And he intended to win. The wind carried the scent of oil and burnt rubber as the Hellfangs gathered in the old scrapyard. Fires flickered in rusted barrels, casting jagged shadows on the torn-up pavement. It was a meeting ground, neutral territory. Tonight it was anything but. Sarge stood near the edge, arms crossed, watching as the bikers split into two camps. Breaker stood beside him, scanning the faces of the men who had arrived. Some were loyalists, men who had served the vulture for years, their jackets still bearing the insignia of his rule. Others, younger and restless, had seen what Sarge had done, what he had taken from the vulture. And they were listening. A few paces ahead, a Hellfang named Bishop spat on the ground. He was older, his beard streaked with gray, his knuckles scarred from years of fights. "We follow the vulture for a reason," he growled. "He built this club from nothing. You think we throw that away 'cause some old war dog thinks he can run the show?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarge didn't react. Breaker did. He stepped forward, voice sharp. "You're still talking like we got a choice. The vulture ain't running the show anymore. He's losing ground. And when he falls, where does that leave us?" Bishop smirked. "Still standing. He's not done yet." A younger biker, Travis, stepped up beside Breaker. "He's right. The vulture's bleeding. We all saw what happened to the warehouse. That was him." He nodded at Sarge. "We follow the vulture. We die with him." Tension thickened. The Hellfangs had never been divided like this. Sarge finally spoke. "You're right about one thing," he said, stepping forward. "I'm not here to run the show, but I'll tell you what I do know. The vulture doesn't care about any of you. To him, you're tools. Your bodies he can throw in front of bullets so he doesn't have to take one." His gaze swept the crowd. "You think you mean something to him? Look at Benny." A few men shifted. Sarge pressed on. "Look at your brothers who are dead in the dirt right now because the vulture used them as shields. That's your loyalty?" He scoffed. "Sounds more like a death sentence." The silence stretched. Then Bishop shook his head, stepping back toward his side. "You're making a mistake," he warned. Travis clenched his jaw. "No, we're making a choice." The line was drawn. Half of the Hellfangs walked toward Sarge and Breaker. The other half, they rode off into the night, back to the vulture. Damon stirred awake just before dawn, the pain in his ribs a dull ache instead of the sharp agony it had been days ago. He sat up slowly, wincing as he adjusted himself on the bed. The cabin was quiet, but he wasn't alone. Riley sat across the room, cleaning her pistol, her expression unreadable. Damon exhaled. "How bad is it?" Riley didn't look up. "Bad?" Damon rubbed his face. "Sarge?" "He's handling it." Damon's stomach twisted. "I need to talk to him." Riley stood. "Then get up." Sarge was outside when Damon limped onto the porch. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, eyes narrowing as he saw his nephew's condition. "You shouldn't be up." Damon smirked. "And yet, here I am." Sarge sighed, walking toward him. "Sit before you fall over." Damon ignored him. "I heard about the meeting, the split." He shook his head. "It's worse than you think." Sarge studied him. "What do you know?" Damon exhaled, his expression tightening. "Before they grabbed me, I was following something. The vulture's got more than just guns moving through this town. He's got connections, politicians, cops, people way higher up than just gangsters." He swallowed. "He's not just a king. He's a puppet master." Sarge's jaw clenched. Damon continued. "I found something, a ledger. It had payments, routes, names. If we can get our hands on it, we can tear his whole operation apart." Breaker, who had been listening from the steps, scoffed. "And where exactly is this magic ledger?" Damon hesitated. Then he said, "With Red." Silence. Breaker cursed under his breath. Riley closed her eyes. Sarge exhaled. "That's a problem." Red wasn't just the vulture's most trusted enforcer. He was the one hunting them now. That night, the first shot came just after midnight. Sarge had been expecting it. The Hellfangs loyal to the vulture had come for them. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, splintering wood, shattering glass. Sarge flipped the table for cover, barking orders. "Move!" Riley was already in position, firing through the window. Breaker grabbed his shotgun, taking a position near the door. Damon ducked low, holding his side. "They're surrounding us!" Sarge didn't have time to think. He just reacted. He fired through the darkness, catching movement in the tree line. A body crumpled. The Hellfangs weren't here to negotiate. They were here to end this. Riley dropped another attacker, cursing as a bullet grazed her arm. "We need an out." Breaker peeked through the side window. "Bikes are out back, but they'll cut us down before we get to them." Sarge scanned the chaos. Then he saw it. A propane tank by the shed. He aimed, fired. The explosion rocked the ground, a blast of fire and smoke tearing through the night. The attackers scrambled, thrown into chaos. Sarge grabbed Damon. "Move, now!" They ran. Bullets whizzed past. Riley covered them, taking out another 2 men before she followed. They reached the bikes. Sarge threw Damon onto one, climbing onto another. Then the second wave hit. Engines roared as more Hellfangs emerged from the darkness. And leading them? Red. He grinned, revving his engine. "Going somewhere, old man?" Sarge clenched his jaw. Red lifted his pistol and fired. The roar of gunfire and engines filled the night as Sarge swerved his bike to the side, narrowly avoiding Red's first shot. The bullet missed his head by inches, kicking up sparks as it ricocheted off the cabin's metal siding. Damon clung to the back of his uncle's bike, his grip weak but desperate. Riley and Breaker were close behind, their engines roaring through the chaos. Hellfangs loyal to the Vulture pursued them, their headlights cutting through the smoke and debris left from the battle at the cabin. Another shot rang out. Sarge gritted his teeth as a bullet tore through his jacket, grazing his shoulder. He barely had time to register the pain before Riley fired back, forcing Red to pull away. Breaker rode up beside Sarge. "We can't outrun 'em forever." Sarge's mind worked fast. The forest road ahead was winding, narrow, perfect for an ambush. He locked eyes with Breaker. "Then we don't." Breaker gave a knowing nod. They skidded off the main road, cutting into the trees. The dense foliage swallowed them, engines growling as they weaved through the darkness. Behind them, Red and his men followed, undeterred. Sarge motioned to Breaker. "Lead 'em in." Breaker grinned. "Don't get yourself killed." With that, he gunned the throttle, leading their pursuers deeper into the woods. Sarge pulled to a stop near an overgrown clearing, sliding off his bike. Riley and Damon followed, finding cover behind the thick trunks. The trap was set. Minutes later, the first bikes roared into the clearing. Sarge fired first. His shot took out the front tire of a Hellfang's bike, sending the rider flying. The others skidded to a stop, scrambling for cover. Red emerged last, slow, deliberate. He dismounted, cracking his knuckles. "I knew you'd run," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "Figured you'd get tired eventually." Sarge stepped forward, gun raised. "Not tired, just ready." Red smirked. "Then let's end this." The fight began. Sarge met Red's charge head-on, dodging the first swing and countering with a brutal elbow to the ribs. Red barely flinched. He grabbed Sarge's arm, twisting hard, forcing the older man to his knees. Riley fired at the other bikers, keeping them pinned down while Breaker fought beside her. Damon stayed low, clutching his injured side. Sarge gritted his teeth as Red drove a knee into his gut. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he didn't stop. He twisted free, striking Red across the jaw. Red staggered but recovered fast. He grabbed a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. Sarge didn't wait. He lunged. The two clashed in a brutal exchange of fists and steel. Red slashed, Sarge dodged. Sarge struck, Red blocked. Blood splattered across the dirt as the fight raged on. Then a gunshot. Breaker yelled out in pain, falling to one knee. A Hellfang had gotten past Riley, landing a shot to his leg. Red saw the opening. He drove his blade forward. Sarge barely turned in time. The knife slashed across his side, tearing flesh. He grunted, stumbling back. Red grinned. "Getting slow, old man." Sarge exhaled, steadying himself. "Still faster than you." He feigned weakness. Red took the bait. As Red lunged for the kill, Sarge sidestepped, grabbing Red's arm and twisting it behind his back. The knife clattered to the ground. Sarge didn't hesitate. He slammed Red's head into a tree. Once. Twice. Red collapsed, blood dripping from his forehead. The fight was over. The surviving Hellfangs retreated. Breaker groaned, clutching his bleeding leg. Riley pressed a hand against the wound, cursing under her breath. Damon limped over, looking at Red's unconscious body. "What do we do with him?" Sarge wiped the blood from his face. "We use him." He knelt beside Red, gripping his collar. "You work for the Vulture," Sarge growled. "You know where he is?" Red chuckled through bloody teeth. "And if I don't tell you?" Sarge drove a fist into his gut. Red wheezed, coughing up blood. Sarge grabbed his face, forcing him to look up. "Where is he?" Red's grin never faded, even as his breathing grew ragged. "You think you're winning?" He chuckled weakly. "You're already dead." Sarge didn't like the way he said it. Riley frowned. "Sarge, we need to go, now." Sarge's gut twisted. Something was wrong. The distant sound of engines roared through the night. A lot of them. Riley turned toward the road, eyes widening. "It's a setup." Sarge's grip on Red tightened. "What did you do?" Red laughed, blood staining his teeth. "Breaker didn't betray you, old man." He coughed. "I did." Sarge's blood ran cold. Damon cursed. "They're coming." Sarge looked at Breaker, his friend, his ally, the man who had fought beside him. Breaker shook his head. "I didn't know." Sarge believed him. But it didn't change the fact that they were surrounded. The Vulture's men were coming, and this time there would be no escape. Far away, the Vulture sat in his private club, watching the chaos unfold on a security feed. He swirled his drink, smirking. Cortez stood beside him. "They won't make it out." The Vulture exhaled. "No, they won't." He tapped his glass against the table, watching as the Hellfangs moved in. "This ends tonight." Sarge stood in the clearing, gripping his pistol. Breaker struggled to his feet, blood staining his jeans. Riley adjusted her grip on her rifle. Damon steadied himself. Engines rumbled closer. This was it. Sarge exhaled, steeling himself. "No more running." The first headlights broke through the darkness. The war was here. The steel mill loomed in the darkness, an abandoned relic of a forgotten era. The rusted framework groaned under the weight of time, and the scent of burning oil still clung to the air like a ghost of its past. It was the perfect battleground. Sarge crouched behind a rusted support beam, gripping his pistol tightly. The sound of approaching engines rumbled through the night like a distant storm. Riley, Breaker, and Damon were beside him, each preparing for what they all knew was coming. "This is it," Breaker murmured. He exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. "One way or another, this ends tonight." Sarge nodded. "No more half measures." Damon wiped sweat from his brow, still weak but determined. "We make it out of this, I'm buying the first round." Riley smirked, checking her rifle. "Then I'll make sure you live long enough to pay up." Sarge listened to the sound of tires screeching outside. The Hellfangs had arrived, and with them, the Vulture's death squad. The first shots rang out before the doors were even kicked open. Bullets ricocheted off steel beams, sending sparks into the darkness. Sarge moved quickly, ducking behind a stack of rusted metal sheets, returning fire as a dozen men stormed into the mill. Breaker fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the hollow space. One of the Vulture's men dropped, but two more replaced him. Damon took cover behind an overturned workbench, wincing as a bullet grazed his arm. "Damn it!" he hissed. Sarge moved to his side, firing twice, dropping another attacker. "Stay low!" Riley climbed up onto the catwalk, taking the high ground. From above, she picked off two men before ducking behind the railing. Below, Red had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Sarge's jaw tightened as he saw Red stride into the mill, his leather jacket soaked with dried blood. He moved like a predator. a shark circling wounded prey. Behind him, the vulture's enforcers flooded in, blocking the exits. Red grinned, his gun held casually in one hand. "Thought you could run forever, old man?" Sarge didn't answer. He just raised his gun. Red laughed. "Good, I was hoping you'd put up a fight." Then the battle erupted. The mill became a war zone. Gunfire filled the air, echoing off steel walls. Sparks rained down as bullets tore through machinery long forgotten. Sarge fought with precision, moving through the chaos like a soldier who had seen too many wars. He took down one man, then another, his aim steady despite the storm around him. Breaker covered his flank, his shotgun booming through the open space. Riley fired from above, but her position was compromised. Two Hellfangs climbed the catwalk, forcing her into a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Damon was pinned down, his back against a rusted conveyor belt. He fired blindly, but he was running out of ammo fast. Then came the explosion. Someone had hit the gas line. The floor shuddered. Fire erupted from the east side of the mill, sending waves of heat through the battlefield. Sarge barely had time to react before a steel beam collapsed, separating him from Breaker. Sarge coughed through the smoke, his vision blurred from the heat. He could barely make out Breaker on the other side of the flames, fighting off 3 men at once. "Breaker!" he shouted. Breaker turned, blood running down his face. "Get out of here." Sarge wasn't leaving him. He fought his way through the inferno, taking down another attacker before reaching his friend's side. Breaker was injured. Badly. A knife was buried deep in his gut. Sarge caught him before he fell. Breaker coughed, blood dripping from his lips. "Guess this is it, huh?" Sarge shook his head. "Not yet." He tried to lift him, but Breaker groaned, shaking his head. "Don't, man. It's too late." Sarge's throat tightened. "No." Breaker smiled weakly. "You gotta finish this. The vulture. He can't walk away from this." He exhaled, his grip tightening on Sarge's arm. "Promise me." Sarge's jaw clenched. He nodded. Breaker let out a weak chuckle. "Hell of a ride." Then he went still. Sarge closed his eyes. Then he stood. He turned, and he saw Red. Red stood on the opposite side of the burning wreckage, watching Breaker's lifeless body with mild amusement. "Damn shame," he mused. "He was a good fighter." Sarge's hands tightened into fists. Red smirked. "Guess it's just you and me now, old man." Sarge didn't respond. He just charged. The final fight began. Fists met flesh. Sarge ducked Red's first swing, driving his own punch into Red's ribs. The enforcer grunted but didn't go down. Red countered with a brutal hook, sending Sarge stumbling. Fire crackled around them. Riley and Damon were still fighting in the distance, but this fight was personal. Red swung again. Sarge caught his arm, twisting it hard. Red howled in pain, but he didn't stop. He drove a knee into Sarge's gut, knocking the wind out of him. Sarge recovered fast. He grabbed a steel pipe from the wreckage, and he swung. The impact cracked against Red's skull, sending him to his knees. Sarge didn't stop. He struck again, and again. Red collapsed, coughing blood, struggling to lift his head. Sarge loomed over him, the pipe raised for the final blow. Red chuckled, his teeth stained red. "Go ahead," he rasped. "Do it." Sarge hesitated. Then he dropped the pipe. Red frowned. "What? No killer instinct?" Sarge stepped back, his voice low. "You're not worth the bullet." Then, before Red could react, Sarge turned and delivered a single, brutal punch. Red's head snapped back, and he fell. For good. The mill burned behind them. Riley and Damon made it out first, coughing from the smoke. Sarge followed, his body aching, his mind numb. Breaker was gone. But the vulture was still out there. And Sarge intended to finish this, no matter what it took. The night was heavy with smoke. The steel mill smoldered behind them, flames flickering in the shattered windows like the last breath of a dying beast. Sarge stood at the edge of the wreckage, his fists clenched, his knuckles bloody. Breaker was gone. He had died in his arms, whispering the last words of a man who knew the end had finally come. Sarge had seen too many men fall like that, on the battlefield, in the streets, in the shadows of wars that never truly ended. But this one hit different. Riley and Damon stood nearby, their faces grim. The Hellfangs were scattered. Some were dead, others had fled. The war was nearing its final hour. Sarge exhaled, staring down at Red's lifeless body. He had kept his promise. The Vulture's enforcer was dead, but the Vulture himself was still out there, and Sarge wasn't finished yet. They drove in silence. The city passed by in a blur of neon lights and dark alleys. Sarge barely felt the rumble of the engine beneath him, barely heard the sound of Riley shifting gears as they cut through the streets. His mind was a storm. Breaker was gone. The words repeated in his head, echoing against the weight in his chest. He had known this war would take more than bullets. It would take pieces of them, rip apart what was left of the old ghosts they carried. But still, he had hoped, and now there was nothing left to hope for. Damon finally spoke. "Where do we go from here?" Sarge's grip on the handlebars tightened. "We finish this." Riley glanced at him. "The Vulture's on the move. After what happened at the mill, he won't stay in one place for long." Damon frowned. "If we don't move fast, we lose our shot." Sarge didn't hesitate. "Then we move now." The Vulture's empire had begun to crumble. The warehouse raid had cut off his weapon supply. The steel mill battle had shattered his forces. And now his lieutenants were abandoning ship, realizing that the old king was bleeding out. Sarge had spent his whole life hunting men like him, and he knew exactly where to look. They found him at the old docks. The Vulture had fled the city, retreating to the edge of the waterfront where his last stronghold stood. The docks had once been a hub for smuggling, guns, drugs, bodies. Now they were silent, haunted by the ghosts of deals gone wrong. Sarge led the way. The three of them moved like shadows through the stacked shipping containers, weapons ready. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rust, the waves lapping quietly against the wooden pier. They spotted movement near the warehouse entrance. 2 guards. Sarge motioned to Riley. She nodded, silent. A second later, 2 suppressed shots whispered through the night. The guards crumpled. They moved forward. Inside the warehouse, the Vulture sat behind a massive steel desk, a cigar burning between his fingers. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single hanging bulb swaying gently above him. Cortez stood beside him, his expression grim. "They're here," he muttered. The Vulture exhaled smoke, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Good." Outside, Sarge and the others positioned themselves at the entrance. "This is it," Riley whispered. Sarge nodded. "No mistakes." Damon exhaled. "Let's end this." Then they moved. The first gunshot shattered the silence. Sarge pushed forward, firing as he moved. The Vulture's remaining men scrambled for cover, bullets tearing through crates and metal beams. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Damon flanked left, ducking behind a rusted car, returning fire. Riley took the high ground, picking off men from the rafters. Sarge had only one target. The Vulture. He cut through the firefight like a man possessed, his eyes locked on the steel desk ahead. Cortez stepped into his path, gun raised. Sarge fired first. Cortez staggered, blood blooming across his chest. Sarge didn't stop. He reached the desk, kicking it aside. And there he was. The Vulture stared at him, unshaken, unafraid. "You took everything from me," he murmured. Sarge didn't flinch. "You took more." The Vulture smirked. "Then finish it." Sarge hesitated. Riley and Damon stood behind him, waiting. The warehouse burned around them, the war coming to its final breath. Sarge's hand tightened around the gun. Breaker's voice echoed in his head. "You gotta finish this." And then he pulled the trigger. The vulture fell. The last of his empire crumbled. Sarge stood over the body, the weight of war pressing against his shoulders. Damon let out a shaky breath. Riley lowered her gun. It was over. Finally. Over. Outside, the night was quiet. The city stretched before them, broken but still standing. Sarge leaned against his bike, staring out at the water. The reflection of flames flickered across the waves. Damon sat beside him. "What now?" Sarge exhaled. "Now. We rebuild." Riley gave a small smile. "Sounds like you're sticking around." Sarge didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the stars. Somewhere, Breaker was watching. Somewhere, the war had finally ended. And for the first time in a long time, Sarge felt peace. He climbed onto his bike, the engine rumbling beneath him. Damon followed, and Riley kicked her engine into gear. They rode away from the burning wreckage, the past left in the ashes. For the first time in a long time, Sarge wasn't chasing ghosts. He was looking toward the future, and this time, he was ready for it. The night air was still heavy with the scent of burning oil and blood. The warehouse stood silent behind them, its foundation cracked, its empire crumbled. The vulture was dead. His reign had ended with a single bullet, and yet Sarge felt no satisfaction. There was no celebration, only the eerie quiet that followed war. Sarge stood over the body, his gun still in his grip, his breath steady. The weight of years, of violence, of ghosts long past, bore down on his shoulders. He had done what needed to be done, and yet something felt unfinished. Damon and Riley watched in silence. The fire that had fueled them, the rage, the hunger for vengeance, it had burned out the moment the vulture fell, and now they were left with only the ashes. Riley broke the silence. "It's over." Sarge didn't answer right away. He stared at the body for a long moment before finally holstering his gun. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." They rode away from the docks in silence. The city streets were empty, abandoned in the wake of the chaos. The Hellfangs had scattered. The syndicate that once controlled them had collapsed in a single night. The war was over. But peace didn't come so easily. Sarge pulled into the empty lot of an old gas station, cutting the engine. Damon and Riley followed, their headlights illuminating the cracked pavement. Damon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "We did it." Sarge didn't respond. He stared ahead, his jaw tight. Riley watched him carefully. "You don't look like a man who just won." Sarge let out a slow breath. "That's because I didn't." Damon frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarge turned to face them. "The vulture's dead, but that doesn't mean this is over." He looked at Damon. "The Hellfangs, what's left of them, are going to be looking for leadership. They can either rebuild, or they can tear this place apart, trying to fill the vacuum." Damon's expression darkened. "You think they'll come after us?" Riley folded her arms. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to pull a Lazarus act." Sarge shook his head. "They won't be coming after us." He turned back toward the road. "They'll be coming after what's left of the city." By morning, the news had already spread. The vulture was dead. His empire had shattered overnight. His lieutenants were either dead or running scared. The streets were quiet, but that quiet was fragile, brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest disturbance. Sarge sat at a diner, his coffee untouched, his thoughts distant. Damon sat across from him, flipping through a newspaper. "They're calling it a power vacuum," Damon muttered. "Some people think a new gang's going to rise up and take the vulture's place." Sarge grunted. "They're not wrong." Riley slid into the booth beside them, setting her pistol on the table. "We should be out of town by now, laying low." Sarge finally took a sip of his coffee. "And what happens when the next vulture rises?" Riley sighed. "You know you can't fight every war." Sarge met her gaze. "I can fight this one." Damon exhaled, rubbing his temples. "So what? We just keep going. Keep fighting until we run out of bullets?" Sarge shook his head. "Not bullets." He looked up. "Leadership?" Damon frowned. "You think I should take over?" Sarge studied him. "Someone will. Better it be you than someone worse." Damon laughed bitterly. "I didn't sign up for this." Sarge's gaze didn't waver. "Neither did I." Silence settled between them. Finally, Damon sighed. "And if I say no?" Sarge leaned back. "Then someone else fills the void, and we go right back to where we started." Riley tapped her fingers against the table. "You really think Damon can turn this around?" Sarge smirked faintly. "He's got more brains than most of those idiots ever did." Damon shook his head. "That's not saying much." By nightfall, the first of the stragglers began to arrive. They found them at an old biker bar on the outskirts of town, the same place this war had begun. Hellfangs, rogues, men who had been part of the Vulture's empire but were now leaderless, directionless. They stood in small clusters, murmuring among themselves, uncertain. Sarge stepped inside, scanning the room. All eyes turned to him. Damon stood beside him, uncomfortable, out of place. "You sure about this?" Damon muttered. Sarge nodded. "You're their only option." One of the older bikers, a man with a thick scar running down his face, leaned against the bar. "So, what's the plan, old man?" Sarge motioned to Damon. "Not my plan, his." The room was silent. Then Damon stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. He spoke. And for the first time in years, the Hellfangs listened. Hours later, Sarge sat outside, staring up at the stars. Riley joined him, taking a drag from her cigarette. "So, that's it? You're leaving it in Damon's hands?" Sarge nodded. "It's his future, not mine." Riley smirked. "You getting soft in your old age?" Sarge chuckled. "Something like that." She flicked the cigarette away, stretching. "So, what now?" Sarge didn't answer right away. He stared out at the empty road ahead, the moonlight casting long shadows across the pavement. Then, finally, he stood, and he smiled. "Now?" He swung a leg over his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him. "Now, I ride." The road stretched ahead, endless, open. The war was over, the city was safe, and for the first time in years, Sarge was free. The last bullet had been fired, and it was time to move on. The remnants of the Hellfangs gathered one last time at the old scrapyard. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and rust, the distant sound of traffic humming beyond the chain-link fence. The once feared biker gang stood in silence, their numbers thinned, their legacy shattered. Sarge watched from the outskirts, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had seen the rise and fall of men like the Vulture before. He had seen empires crumble, gangs dissolve, soldiers disappear into the wind. And yet something about this felt different. Damon stood at the center, eyes scanning the broken men around him. These weren't warriors anymore. They were survivors. "The Hellfangs are done," he said finally, his voice steady. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some expected it, others refused to accept it. An older biker, Lynch, shook his head. "This club's been around for years. We can't just walk away." Damon met his gaze. "We're not walking away. We're rebuilding." He exhaled. "But not like before." Silence. Sarge watched as Damon continued. "The Vulture built this gang on fear, on power. And look where it got us. Dead men. A city drowning in blood. That's not what we're going to be." He looked around. No more drugs. No more running weapons. No more being pawns for corrupt men who don't give a damn if we live or die." Some of the men scoffed. Lynch narrowed his eyes. "So what the hell are we supposed to be?" Damon didn't hesitate. "A new kind of crew. One that protects the people who need it. One that fights the right battles." He stepped forward. "We owe this town. We've torn it apart for years. It's time we give something back." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Travis, one of the younger bikers, nodded. "I'm in." A few others nodded as well. Lynch sighed, rubbing his face. "Damn kid," he muttered, then shook his head. "All right, let's see if this works." Damon nodded. "It will." Sarge watched in silence. Damon wasn't the same reckless kid who had gotten himself caught up in this war. He was something else now. A leader. But Sarge wasn't sure if he wanted to stick around to see where it all led. Later that night, Sarge stood outside the cabin, watching the moonlight spill across the quiet forest. His bike was parked beside him, packed, ready. Riley walked up, hands in her jacket pockets. "So, you're really leaving?" Sarge exhaled. "Yeah." She leaned against the railing. "You think Damon's got this?" Sarge nodded slowly. "He's got more guts than most men twice his age." Riley smirked. "You trained him well." Sarge shook his head. "He learned on his own." He glanced at her. "You sticking around?" She shrugged. "For a little while. See if this new, better world he wants to build is real." Sarge gave a small chuckle. "Let me know how that turns out." Riley's smirk faded. "You sure you don't belong here?" Sarge didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the road ahead. Finally, he exhaled. "I was never meant to stay." Riley nodded, understanding. But before she could say anything else, Damon appeared at the door. "You leaving without saying goodbye?" Sarge turned, meeting his nephew's gaze. Damon stepped forward. "After everything?" Sarge sighed. "You don't need me here." Damon frowned. "That's not the point." Sarge watched him. "You got this handled, kid. You don't need an old war dog watching over you." Damon shook his head. "Maybe, but you don't have to do this alone." Sarge looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a worn-out patch, the insignia of his old unit, faded but still intact. He handed it to Damon. Damon took it, confused. Sarge nodded toward it. "That was mine. Before all this." Damon looked at it, then back at Sarge. "Why are you giving this to me?" Sarge's voice was quiet. "Because you remind me of the man I used to be." Damon swallowed hard, gripping the patch tightly. Sarge stepped back, swinging a leg over his bike. Damon took a deep breath. "You don't have to leave." Sarge started the engine. Damon clenched his jaw. "At least stay until morning." Sarge hesitated. Then he exhaled and killed the engine. "All right, one last night." Damon smirked. "Good." Inside the cabin, they sat around the fire. The air was thick with smoke and memories. Lynch and Travis sat at the table, going over plans for the new club. Riley leaned against the wall, listening but saying nothing. Damon handed Sarge a beer. Sarge took it, raising it slightly. "To the fallen," Damon said. Everyone raised their bottles. Sarge stared at his. Then he drank. Tomorrow he would leave. But tonight he would stay. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. As the night stretched on, the conversations around the fire turned softer. The once broken men who had survived the Vulture's reign found themselves in an unfamiliar place. One without orders, without fear, without the certainty of war. Lynch leaned back, glancing at Sarge. "You sure you ain't sticking around, old man?" Sarge smirked faintly, taking another sip of his beer. "You got enough leaders. You don't need another." Damon looked over. doesn't mean we wouldn't want one." Sarge exhaled, looking out at the dark horizon. The road had always called to him, always pulled him away before he could ever plant roots, and yet something about this place, these people, made him pause. But the road was where he belonged. Tomorrow he would leave, and this time he wouldn't be looking back. The fire crackled as the group sat in silence. For the first time in years, the future felt uncertain, not in a way that spelled doom, but in a way that left room for something new. Sarge looked at Damon one last time. He was ready. And with that, Sarge knew it was time for him to go. This war was over. The Hellfangs had been dismantled, and Sarge was finally free. The dawn crept in slowly, its golden light stretching across the horizon, touching the edges of the quiet town. The war was over, the Hellfangs dismantled, and yet Sarge felt no relief. He sat on the porch of the cabin, the weight of years pressing down on him. Today was the day he would leave. His bike was packed, his jacket worn and faded, the old scars on his hands aching in the morning chill. He had done what he had come here to do. He had fought the fight, buried his ghosts, and now he had no reason to stay. The front door creaked open behind him. Damon stepped out, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You leaving now?" Sarge exhaled, nodding. Damon sat beside him, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" Sarge looked at him. "I've been sure for a long time." Damon ran a hand through his hair. "Feels weird. You just... going." Sarge gave a small smirk. "You don't need me anymore." Damon scoffed. "Doesn't mean I want you to leave." Sarge patted his shoulder. "You'll be fine." Damon exhaled. "You could stay, you know, just for a while." Sarge didn't answer. He just stared at the road ahead. The silence stretched between them, unspoken words filling the space where goodbye should have been. Then a sound. Distant. Engines. Damon stiffened. "You hear that?" Sarge's eyes narrowed. More engines, and they were getting closer. The roar of motorcycles broke the morning peace, their tires kicking up dust as they sped down the road toward the cabin. Sarge and Damon were already on their feet, eyes sharp, instincts honed. Riley stepped out onto the porch, gun in hand. "We expecting company?" Sarge's jaw tightened. Not the good kind. Within moments, the bikes skidded to a stop in the clearing. 5 men, no familiar faces. They weren't Hellfangs. Not anymore. A man stepped forward, his leather jacket patched with a symbol Sarge didn't recognize. "You Sarge?" he asked. Sarge didn't answer. The man smirked. "Thought so." He glanced at Damon. "Word is, you're trying to rebuild. That true?" Damon folded his arms. "Who's asking?" The man grinned. "New blood. See, when a king falls, the vultures come picking at the scraps, and we heard there's a whole lot of scraps left behind." Riley tightened her grip on her gun. "You're a little late for that." The man chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong." He looked back at his crew. "We ain't here to pick a fight. We're here to take what's left." Damon stepped forward. "Not happening." The man raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? And what's stopping us?" Sarge stepped up beside Damon. He didn't have to say a word. The silence stretched. Then the man chuckled. "Huh, guess you still got some fight left in you." He shrugged. "All right, old man, have it your way." He turned to his crew. "Let's go." The bikes roared to life. But before they left, the man looked back. "This ain't over." Then they were gone. The dust settled. Damon exhaled. "They'll be back." Sarge nodded. "Yeah." Riley sighed. "Damn it." Damon turned to Sarge. "Still think you should leave?" Sarge stared at the road. His road. Then finally he sighed. "No." Damon grinned. "Good." Inside the cabin, the old map was rolled out across the table. Damon pointed at key locations outlining the remaining power struggles in the city. "They're looking to take whatever's left," Damon muttered. "We need to make sure there's nothing for them to take." Lynch leaned over the map, nodding. "We gotta lock things down before they spread too far." Sarge listened, arms crossed. He wasn't planning on staying. But now? Now, he had no choice. He had no choice. Riley smirked at him. "Guess you're stuck with us a little longer." Sarge sighed, shaking his head. "Yeah." He looked at Damon. "One last time." Damon grinned. "That's what you said yesterday." Sarge smirked. Then he picked up his gun. The fire crackled as the group sat around it, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. For the first time in a long while, there was no immediate war, no next move to plan, just quiet contemplation of what came next. Lynch exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Feels weird, don't it? Not having orders barked at us, not waiting for the next bloodbath." Travis nodded. "Yeah, almost don't know what to do with myself." Damon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we figure it out, together." He looked around. "We're not going to be what we were before. We're going to be something better." Sarge listened in silence. He had heard words like these before back when he was still in the service. Men who swore they'd change, that they'd find a way to make things right. Some had, others hadn't. And yet, as he looked at Damon, he saw something different. Damon wasn't just saying it. He believed it, and that meant there was a chance. As the night deepened, Sarge stood, stretching out his stiff muscles. Damon looked up at him. "You turning in?" Sarge shook his head. "Gonna get some air." Riley smirked. "Yeah, sure. That's code for gonna have a deep moment of reflection about whether I should stay or leave." Sarge chuckled. "Maybe." She raised her beer in mock salute. "Take your time, old man." Sarge walked toward the clearing, staring at the empty road beyond. The wind was cool against his face, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. He ran a hand over the seat of his bike. He could leave now. No one would stop him. No one would blame him. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Maybe, just maybe, this was where he was supposed to be. At least for now. The fire behind him still crackled, and as he turned back to the cabin, he saw the people inside. The people he had fought beside, bled beside. His family. Sarge sighed, shaking his head with a faint smirk. Looks like he wasn't leaving just yet. The morning sun had barely risen when the first attack came. Sarge was up early, sitting on the cabin's porch with a cup of coffee when he heard the low, menacing growl of approaching motorcycles. He didn't need to see them to know they weren't friendly. He set his coffee down and reached for his gun. Damon and Riley emerged from the cabin, already armed. "Looks like they didn't wait long," Riley muttered. Damon's face hardened. "Told you they'd be back." The sound of the engines grew louder as they neared the clearing. More this time. Not just 5 men like before, at least a dozen. Sarge exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured. "Let's get to work." The first shots rang out before the bikes even stopped. Sarge dove behind the porch railing as bullets splintered the wooden beams. Riley returned fire from the doorway while Damon sprinted toward the side of the cabin, using the trees for cover. The gang, whoever they were, spread out quickly, flanking the cabin from both sides. They knew what they were doing, which meant they weren't just some low-level thugs. Sarge popped up, fired 2 quick shots, and dropped one of the attackers. He ducked as a return volley slammed into the porch post beside his head. "They're trying to box us in," Damon shouted. Sarge nodded grimly. "Then we break the box." Lynch and Travis burst out of the back entrance, laying down cover fire as Sarge, Damon, and Riley made their move. The gunfight turned brutal, fast. Smoke and dust filled the air, bullets zipping through the trees, shattering glass and wood. Sarge took out another attacker, then another, but they kept coming. Riley was pinned down behind the cabin's truck, her clip nearly empty. "I need ammo," she shouted. Damon tossed her a fresh magazine. "We need to push them back." Sarge saw an opening. "Cover me." Without waiting, he sprinted forward, weaving through the gunfire. He slammed into one of the attackers, knocking him to the ground before firing point blank. Another turned, too slow. Sarge's bullet caught him in the chest. The remaining men hesitated. That was all they needed. Damon and Riley pressed forward, driving them back. Within minutes, the remaining attackers scrambled for their bikes, retreating. A final shot echoed as Riley dropped the last one before he could escape. Silence followed. Smoke curled into the sky. Sarge exhaled. It was over. For now. Inside the cabin, they regrouped. Travis had taken a graze to the arm, nothing serious. Everyone else was unharmed. Damon paced. "We can't just sit here waiting for the next attack." Sarge wiped the blood from his hands. "We won't." Riley leaned against the table. Who the hell were they? Lynch shook his head. Not randoms. They were trained. He looked at Sarge, which means someone with power sent them. Sarge's jaw clenched. The Vulture's ghost. Damon frowned. He's dead. Sarge met his gaze. But his empire isn't. Riley sighed. So what now? Sarge looked at Damon. "We finish what we started." Damon nodded. It was time to end this. For good. They rode into town later that afternoon, weapons ready. Sarge had been here before, walking into a battlefield knowing damn well the fight wasn't over yet. Only this time, it wasn't a foreign war zone. It was home. The remnants of the Vulture's men had retreated to an old industrial park, their last stronghold. If they weren't stopped now, they'd rebuild. They'd come back stronger. That wasn't an option. Sarge led the way, his bike roaring as they pulled up to the abandoned warehouse. Damon, Riley, Lynch, and Travis followed. They knew the risks. They didn't care. This was the last stand. No more running. No more hiding. They were taking the fight straight to them. The ambush came fast. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops as they entered the yard. The Hellfangs dove for cover, returning fire. Sarge rolled behind a stack of crates, firing 2 shots upward. One shooter dropped. Damon and Riley moved together, pushing toward the main warehouse entrance. Lynch covered the rear, taking out a pair of enemies trying to flank. Sarge reloaded. Then he moved. Inside, the fight turned brutal. Close quarters. No room for hesitation. Sarge took down one man with a knife, spinning just in time to block another's attack. Damon and Riley fought their way through the corridors, forcing the Vulture's remaining lieutenants to retreat. Then they reached the office. The last man standing. The true mastermind. And Sarge finally understood. It was Cortez, the Vulture's second in command. Sarge raised his gun. "You should have stayed dead." Cortez grinned. "So should you." The final battle began. The gunfire outside faded, but inside, Sarge and Cortez faced each other, weapons drawn. Cortez smirked. "You think killing me will end this?" Sarge didn't respond. He just pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Cortez square in the chest. The man staggered, falling to his knees, coughing blood. Sarge stepped forward. "This ends today." Cortez looked up, grinning through the pain. "You'll never stop it." Sarge fired again. This time Cortez didn't get back up. Outside, Damon was waiting. "It's done," Sarge said. Damon let out a breath. "We won." Sarge looked at the burning warehouse. "Yeah." Riley walked up. "So, what now?" Sarge glanced at Damon. "Now, you lead." Damon hesitated. "And you?" Sarge smirked. "I think my fight's finally over." Damon nodded. "You earned it." Sarge looked at the sunrise breaking over the city. For the first time in years, he felt free. Legends never die. But sometimes they finally get to rest. The city still smelled of smoke. Even after the final battle, after the last gunshot rang out, the air remained thick with the weight of everything that had happened. The vulture was dead. His empire had crumbled. But the scars he left behind ran deep. Damon stood outside the old Hellfangs clubhouse, staring at what remained. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, the once proud insignia now faded, torn. Everything about it reeked of a past he wanted to leave behind. But leaving it behind wasn't an option. Not anymore. Riley leaned against the rusted fence, watching him. "You gonna stand there all day?" Damon exhaled. "I don't know if I can fix this." Sarge, who had been silent for most of the morning, finally spoke. "You don't fix it, kid. You rebuild it." Damon turned to him. "And what if I screw it up?" Sarge met his gaze. "Then you get up and try again." Silence. Then Damon nodded. "All right." It was time to start something new. Something better. The next few days were spent clearing out the last remnants of the vulture's influence. The city had been ruled by fear for too long, and even though the war was over, people were still afraid. Businesses that had been forced into the vulture's pocket hesitated to open their doors. Streets that had been battlegrounds remained empty. It wasn't just about taking out the bad guys. It was about restoring trust. And trust was hard-earned. Damon made the first move. He and Lynch visited the small businesses the vulture had once controlled, letting them know that the reign of terror was over. Some were skeptical. Others didn't care. They had heard promises before. Damon didn't blame them. Riley took a different approach. She reached out to the younger bikers, the ones who had been caught in the middle of the war and were now left without a cause. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted power. But there were a few, just a few, who wanted something else. A fresh start. And that was the group Riley focused on. Meanwhile, Sarge watched. Not because he wanted to interfere, but because he wanted to make sure Damon didn't repeat the same mistakes. One night, as they sat around a makeshift fire outside the clubhouse, Travis spoke up. "So, what are we now?" Damon exhaled. "We're not the Hellfangs anymore." Lynch raised an eyebrow. "Then what the hell are we?" Damon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We're something new." Riley smirked. "That's real descriptive." Damon chuckled. "We're not going to be like the vulture. No drug runs, no extortion, no more of the old ways." Travis frowned. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Sarge finally spoke. "You protect this city. You protect the people in it. You ride for something bigger than yourselves." The fire crackled. The group was silent. Then Damon nodded. "Yeah, that." And just like that, the new era began. Not everyone was on board. Some of the old Hellfangs, the ones who had lived too long in the shadows, didn't want change. They saw Damon as weak. They saw the new way as cowardice. And so they left. That was fine. Damon didn't need them. He needed the ones who believed. Slowly, things started to shift. The city began to heal. Streets that had been abandoned filled with life again. People started walking without looking over their shoulders. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was a start. One evening, Sarge and Damon stood outside the clubhouse watching the sun set. Damon sighed. "You ever think about what's next?" Sarge smirked. "Kid, I stopped thinking about next a long time ago." Damon chuckled. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this." Sarge looked at him. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing." Damon nodded. "I guess so." A long pause. Then Sarge clapped him on the shoulder. "You're doing all right, kid." Damon smiled. "Thanks." Sarge looked at the road stretching ahead. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he didn't have to ride it alone. The clubhouse wasn't just a building. It was a symbol, a relic of what had been. Now, Damon wanted to turn it into something more, something meaningful. They started by tearing down the parts that were unsalvageable, the blood-stained walls, the broken furniture, the old banners that bore a name now buried with its past. It wasn't just about cleaning up, it was about starting over. Sarge watched as the crew worked late into the night, replacing broken doors, scrubbing out the last remnants of the Vulture's reign. He saw something in them he hadn't seen before. Hope. One morning, Lynch arrived with news. "We've got movement on the east side," he said, setting a map on the table. "Some of the leftover gangs are trying to claim what's left." Damon studied the map. "We handle it?" Lynch nodded. "Already took care of the worst of them. But it's not going to stop." Sarge crossed his arms. "That's the price of power. Someone's always going to want it." Damon exhaled. "Then we make sure they know we're here to protect, not rule." Travis smirked. "Easier said than done." Damon met his gaze. "Nothing worth doing is ever easy." Sarge couldn't help but smile. Damon had changed. He wasn't just leading, he was becoming something more. As the days passed, Sarge felt the road calling to him again. But every time he thought about leaving, he found another reason to stay. Maybe it wasn't about the road anymore. Maybe it was about where it led. And for now, it led right here. The road to redemption wasn't just for the city. It was for all of them, including him. The aftermath of war is never clean. The city was changing, but its wounds ran deep. The Vulture's reign had left scars on more than just the streets. People were hesitant to trust, hesitant to believe that the violence was truly over. The echoes of gunfire still lived in their minds, the fear still present in their eyes. Sarge saw it every time he walked through town. The way shopkeepers glanced up with nervous eyes when the rumble of motorcycles approached. The way children clung a little tighter to their parents when unfamiliar men rode past. The way even the victors, the ones who had fought alongside him, carried themselves differently now. Some wounds healed, others didn't. Damon spent his days at the clubhouse trying to build something new, something worth following. The old Hellfangs had been dismantled, and in its place he wanted something better. But the past refused to stay buried. One evening, Travis approached him with a grim expression. "Got a problem," he said. Damon sighed. "When don't we?" Travis didn't smile. "It's the old Hellfangs, the ones who left. They're making moves, small stuff for now, shakedowns, intimidation. But it's only a matter of time before it gets worse." Damon's jaw clenched. He had known this day would come. Not everyone wanted redemption. Some men only understood power. Sarge sat on the porch of the clubhouse watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower. He had been expecting something like this. The past never let go that easily. Riley sat beside him, lighting a cigarette. "You think he's ready for this?" Sarge exhaled slowly. "Doesn't matter if he is." He looked at her. "It's coming either way." Riley nodded. "Yeah, figured." She took a drag. "You gonna step in?" Sarge smirked. "Not unless I have to." Riley exhaled. "Well, that makes one of us." Damon didn't want another war, but peace wasn't something you just declared. It had to be fought for. So he gathered his crew, the ones who had stayed. Lynch, Travis, Riley, and the younger bikers who wanted something different. They had all earned their scars, their battle wounds, but they weren't looking for another fight. Not unless it was necessary. Damon knew the weight of leadership now. Every decision had consequences. So, when word came that a group of old Hellfangs was setting up in a bar downtown, making trouble, he made his choice. They would go, but not to start a fight. To end one before it began. The bar was dimly lit, filled with smoke and tension. The moment Damon and his crew walked in, the room shifted. Conversations hushed. Eyes turned. The old Hellfangs were there, led by a man named Royce, one of the Vulture's former enforcers. Royce smirked as he leaned back against the bar. "Well, well, look what we have here." Damon met his gaze. "You know why I'm here." Royce chuckled. "Yeah? And what do you think's gonna happen, kid?" Damon didn't flinch. "I'm here to tell you this stops now. You want to ride? Ride. You want to live your life? Do it. But you start pushing people around again? You start trying to rebuild what's already dead?" He took a step forward. "I'll put you in the ground myself." Silence. Then Royce laughed. A slow, mocking sound. "You really think you can stop this?" Royce shook his head. "This town's always been the same. You take out one king, another steps up." Damon's voice was steady. "Not this time." Royce studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You know what? Fine. You want to pretend things are different? Go ahead. But don't come crying when the real world catches up to you." Damon didn't move. He didn't blink. Royce waved a dismissive hand. "Get out of my bar." Damon turned, his crew following him. No punches were thrown. No blood was spilled. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, Riley exhaled. "Well, that could have gone worse." Lynch shook his head. "It's not done." Damon knew that, too. He looked at Sarge, who had been waiting by the bikes. The old man didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Damon nodded. "Yeah, I know." That night the attack came. They had expected it. Royce's men hit the clubhouse hard, throwing Molotovs, shooting from the shadows. The flames licked at the walls, but the crew fought back. Sarge moved like a ghost, picking off attackers with precision. Riley and Lynch held the perimeter, keeping the fire contained. Damon went straight for Royce. The fight was brutal. Fists, knives, blood on the concrete. Damon wasn't a boy anymore. He didn't hesitate. When Royce went down, gasping for breath, Damon stood over him. The man was beaten, bloody, defeated, but not dead. Damon stepped back. "You're done." Royce spat blood. "You think this changes anything?" Damon didn't answer. He just walked away. By morning, the clubhouse still stood, scarred, burned, but standing, like all of them. Sarge watched Damon as the younger man cleaned blood from his hands. He had made his choice. He wasn't the Vulture. He wasn't Royce. He was something new. Sarge exhaled. "Not bad, kid." Damon looked up. "It's not over." Sarge smirked. "It never is." But for now, they had survived. And sometimes that was enough. The past has a way of finding you, no matter how fast you ride. Sarge had spent years outrunning ghosts, leaving behind a trail of old battlefields, abandoned friendships, and buried memories. But some things refused to stay buried. The letter arrived on a quiet morning. It was waiting for him on the bar counter when he walked into the clubhouse. An old envelope, yellowed with time, the edges slightly frayed. No return address. Sarge frowned. Riley, who was nursing a cup of coffee, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know you still got mail." Sarge ignored her and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. A name he hadn't thought about in years. Mac Holloway. A friend. A brother-in-arms. Someone he had believed dead. Sarge's hands tightened around the letter as he read the words inside. "Sarge, if you're reading this, I need you. It's about Rook. He's alive, and he's coming for us." Sarge exhaled. The past had caught up. Again. Damon watched as Sarge sat alone, the letter still in his hands. After a long silence, he finally asked, "Who's Rook?" Sarge's jaw tensed. "A mistake I thought was long gone." Damon sat down. "Talk to me." Sarge hesitated. He didn't like digging up old ghosts, but some stories needed telling. He exhaled, leaning back. "Mac, Rook, and I, we served together, same unit, same hellhole. We made it out when others didn't. But Rook, he wasn't like us." Damon frowned. "How so?" Sarge's gaze darkened. "Some men are made for war. Others let war make them into something worse." Damon said nothing, letting him continue. Sarge clenched his fists. "After we got back, Rook didn't know how to turn it off. He got into some bad business. Merc work, black market weapons, dirty contracts. He killed for money, and he didn't care who got in the way." Damon leaned forward. "And you?" Sarge's voice was low. "I tried to stop him." The silence stretched between them. Damon finally broke it. "And now?" Sarge set the letter down. "Now he's back." And that could only mean one thing: trouble. Mac's last known location was an old safe house on the outskirts of town. Sarge rode out alone, leaving Damon and the others behind. This wasn't their fight. Not yet. The house was exactly how Sarge remembered it. Isolated, quiet, the kind of place a man went when he didn't want to be found. He knocked once, then twice. The door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, older, lean, his face carved by time and war. Mac Holloway. The years had done a number on him, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, watchful. "Sarge," Mac said, his voice rough with age and regret. Sarge nodded. "Long time." Mac stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of old wood and gun oil. Sarge sat while Mac poured them both a drink. "Rook's alive," Mac said, getting straight to the point. Sarge nodded. "I figured." Mac leaned forward. "It's worse than that. He's got men, a crew, trained killers, and he's been asking about us." Sarge exhaled. "You sure?" Mac slid a crumpled photograph across the table. Sarge picked it up. Rook. Older. Harsher. Standing with a group of men who looked like they'd walked out of a war zone. And they were armed to the teeth. Sarge's grip tightened on the photo. "What does he want?" Mac hesitated. Then he said, "Revenge." The next few hours were spent piecing together the story. Rook had resurfaced months ago, taking contracts across the country. But this wasn't just about business. It was personal. "He blames us," Mac said, "for what happened back then." Sarge clenched his jaw. "It was his call. He pulled the trigger." Mac nodded. "And now he's decided we're the ones who need to pay for it." Sarge looked at the photo again. This wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence. Damon was waiting when Sarge got back. "You found him?" Sarge nodded. Damon studied his face. "And?" Sarge exhaled. "It's worse than I thought." Riley, standing nearby, folded her arms. "How bad?" Sarge looked at both of them. Then he said, "We're being hunted." Silence. Damon straightened. "By who?" Sarge's voice was cold. "By a ghost." That night, Sarge sat alone, staring at the old photograph. He had spent his whole life fighting wars. Now, one of them had come back for him. There was no running, no hiding, only one way this ended, with blood. And he would be ready. The sun had barely risen when Sarge received the news. Lynch found him first, his face grim. "We got a problem." Sarge set down his coffee. "What kind?" Lynch glanced around before speaking low. "Damon's been betrayed." Sarge's eyes narrowed. "By who?" Lynch hesitated. Then he said, "One of his own." The words settled heavy in the air. Sarge stood. "Tell me everything." The clubhouse was tense. The crew sat around the table, the weight of the news thick between them. Damon stood at the head, his jaw clenched, hands resting on the table's surface. Travis, Riley, and a few of the younger members sat nearby. Lynch stood at the door, keeping watch. Sarge took his seat and looked at Damon. "Let's hear it." Damon exhaled slowly. "Rook's got someone on the inside, someone feeding him information. That's how they knew about our movements, our weak spots." Sarge's expression darkened. "You know who?" Damon's eyes burned with quiet fury. "Yeah." He turned his gaze toward the far end of the room. Jace, a younger recruit, one of the newer members Damon had trusted. Jace sat with his head low, his hands shaking slightly. Riley broke the silence. "Tell me you didn't." Jace swallowed hard. Damon slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "Don't lie." His voice was cold, controlled. "You gave Rook information. You put us in danger." Jace's eyes welled up. "I didn't have a choice." Sarge's voice was calm, but firm. "Everyone has a choice, kid." Jace looked at him desperately. "They took my sister, said if I didn't help them, they'd kill her." Silence. Then Riley spoke, her voice sharp. "And you didn't come to us." Jace lowered his head. I thought I could handle it. But they kept asking for more, and I didn't know how to stop." Damon took a deep breath, his anger barely contained. "Where is she?" Jace wiped his face. "Warehouse, South Docks." Sarge stood. "Then we get her." Jace looked up, hopeful. "You'd help?" Sarge's gaze was unreadable. "She's innocent." He turned to Damon. "But when this is done, we settle the debt." Damon nodded. "Agreed." Jace swallowed hard but said nothing. He knew what was coming. The warehouse was heavily guarded. Sarge, Damon, Riley, Lynch, and Travis moved in the shadows, watching from a distance. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their stance disciplined, military-like. Sarge studied them carefully. Rook's training his people well. Damon gritted his teeth. "Let's remind them who they're up against." Riley smirked. "Thought you'd never say it." They moved in silence. Lynch took out the first guard with a chokehold, dragging him into the shadows. Travis handled the second, slamming his head against a crate. Sarge motioned to Damon. "You get the girl, we'll handle the rest." Damon nodded and slipped into the building. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil and salt water. A few guards lingered by the back entrance, unaware of what was coming. Damon moved quickly, using the cover of shadows. He spotted the girl, tied to a chair, her face bruised, eyes wide with fear. 2 guards stood nearby. Damon didn't hesitate. He grabbed the first by the back of the neck and slammed him into a metal beam. The second turned, reaching for his weapon, but Damon was faster. A single strike to the throat sent him gasping to the floor. Jace's sister whimpered. Damon crouched down. "It's okay. We're getting you out." She nodded weakly. Then the gunfire started. Outside, the ambush came fast. Sarge ducked behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the night. Riley and Lynch returned fire, their aim precise. Travis shouted, "We need to move!" Sarge fired 3 shots, dropping 2 enemies. "Hold the line." Lynch reloaded. "Damon better be moving fast." Inside, Damon freed the girl and hoisted her onto his back. Time to go. They moved toward the exit, but more guards poured in. Damon cursed. "Riley, we need cover." She heard him, and she delivered. An explosion rocked the side of the warehouse as she threw a grenade toward the enemy line. The distraction was enough. Sarge motioned. "Move!" Damon and the girl sprinted for the exit. They barely made it. Back at the clubhouse, the air was thick with tension. Jace knelt in the center of the room, his hands bound. Damon stood over him. "You lied to us." His voice was quiet but deadly. Jace shook. "I didn't have a choice." Sarge watched, silent. Damon took a step closer. "You betrayed us." Jace's voice cracked. "I just wanted her safe." Damon clenched his jaw. Sarge finally spoke. "That's the thing about debts, kid. They always come due." Jace looked up, pleading. "Please." Damon closed his eyes for a moment. Then he exhaled. "You're out." Jace's eyes widened. "You're letting me go?" Damon's voice was final. "You walk away now. If I ever see you again—" He didn't have to finish. Jace nodded, tears streaming down his face. He stood, his legs shaking. Then he left. Travis exhaled. "You sure about that?" Damon sat down, rubbing his temples. "He's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." Silence. Then Sarge stood. "Rook knows we're coming. We need to be ready." Damon nodded. "Tomorrow, we finish this." Sarge met his gaze. One way or another. And the room fell into silence. The final war had begun. The night was unnaturally still. The city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm. The war wasn't just coming, it was here. Sarge had seen this kind of fight before, and he knew how it would end. Not everyone was walking away. They gathered in the clubhouse for the last time. No more plans. No more waiting. This was it. Sarge looked around the room. Damon, Riley, Lynch, Travis, his soldiers, his family. He had spent a lifetime fighting wars, but this one mattered. Damon set his gun on the table. "We know where Rook is." Lynch nodded. "He's waiting for us." Sarge exhaled. "Then let's not disappoint him." The steel mill loomed in the distance, abandoned and rusting. It was the perfect battleground, open enough to trap their enemies but enclosed enough to force the fight. Rook's men were already there, armed, ready. Damon glanced at Sarge. No turning back. Sarge smirked. Never did like turning. Then the shooting started. Bullets tore through the air as both sides clashed. The mill echoed with gunfire, the sharp clang of metal and the deep roar of explosions shaking the foundation. Sarge moved with deadly precision, his years of experience guiding every shot. He dropped 2 men before they even saw him coming. Riley took cover behind a steel beam, returning fire. "They brought a damn army." Lynch gritted his teeth. "Then let's make 'em regret it." Damon fought like a man with nothing to lose, moving through the chaos with deadly efficiency. This wasn't about survival. This was about finishing it. Then Rook stepped forward. A titan of a man, grizzled, scarred, with eyes as cold as death. He carried himself like a warlord, his presence commanding the battlefield. Sarge locked eyes with him. Rook smirked. "Didn't think you'd actually show, old man." Sarge tightened his grip on his gun. "I finish what I start." Rook chuckled. "You always did." He cracked his knuckles. "Shame it has to end like this." Sarge didn't answer. There was no need. They both knew how this would end. The gunfight exploded again, more brutal than before. Sarge and Rook's forces tore into each other, bodies dropping, blood staining the rusted floors. Travis went down first. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Riley pulled him to cover, her face twisted in rage. Lynch took out 3 men before a shotgun blast sent him sprawling. Damon screamed in fury, mowing down Rook's men, his rage fueling every shot. Sarge didn't notice his own wounds until he felt the warmth of blood seeping through his shirt. It didn't matter. Not yet. Not until Rook was dead. The fight came down to them. 2 men, 2 soldiers, no more guns. Just fists, steel, and old grudges. Rook swung first, a brutal right hook that sent Sarge stumbling. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he barely registered it. He retaliated. A sharp jab to the jaw, a knee to the stomach. Rook grunted, wiping blood from his mouth. "Still got some fight in you." Sarge spat blood. Always. They clashed again, raw, brutal. Each hit was personal. Each strike was years of unfinished war. Then Sarge saw his opening. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from the ground and swung. The impact cracked across Rook's skull. The warlord staggered. Sarge didn't stop. Another hit, and another. Rook dropped to his knees, coughing blood, his breath ragged. He looked up at Sarge, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Guess you finally won?" Sarge exhaled, gripping the crowbar tighter. Then he let it fall. "I'm done fighting ghosts." He turned and walked away. Behind him, Rook collapsed, the last breath leaving his body. The battle was over. What was left of Rook's men had scattered. The steel mill was silent again, the only sound the crackle of distant flames. Damon sat on the ground, his hands shaking. Riley tended to Travis, who was barely holding on. Lynch coughed, grinning through the pain. "Guess we did it." Sarge nodded, but he knew. Not all of them were leaving. He looked down at his side, at the blood pooling beneath him. Damon noticed. "No." He moved forward, panic in his voice. "Sarge, hold on." Sarge chuckled weakly. "Ain't my choice, kid." His vision blurred. He could hear their voices, distant now. And then, darkness. When Sarge woke, he wasn't sure if he was dead. The world was dim, blurred. Pain wrapped around him like an old friend. Then he heard Damon's voice. "Sarge?" He blinked. He was in the clubhouse. Alive. Barely. Damon grinned, relief washing over his face. "You stubborn bastard." Sarge groaned. "Guess I ain't done yet." Riley smirked. "Not yet." Lynch patted his shoulder. "You scared the hell out of us." Sarge exhaled, looking at them, his family. The war was over. But his story? Not yet finished. The days after the battle were eerily quiet. The war was over, but the scars remained. The steel mill still smoldered. The streets still bore the weight of the blood that had been spilled. The Vulture's empire had crumbled. Rook was dead, and yet the silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos before. Sarge sat outside the clubhouse, a cigarette between his fingers. He watched as Damon moved among the crew, what was left of them. Riley was helping Travis recover from his wounds. Lynch was handling the last of the cleanup. They had won. But the cost was high. Sarge exhaled smoke into the cool air. His side still ached from the bullet wound, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on him. It was the realization that his time here was done. Damon found him later that evening. "You look like hell," Damon said, grabbing a chair and sitting across from Sarge. Sarge smirked. "Been told that a few times." Damon was quiet for a moment, then asked, "You leaving, aren't you?" Sarge took a long drag from his cigarette before nodding. "Yeah." Damon exhaled. "You don't have to." Sarge looked at him. "Yeah, kid, I do." The next morning, Sarge walked through the town one last time. The people who had once looked at him with fear now nodded in quiet respect. The shopkeepers who had been forced to pay the Vulture's men now stood free of their chains. The city was still rough, still broken, but it was theirs again. And Damon was the one who would keep it that way. Sarge knew it in his bones. He had spent his life fighting other men's wars. This was never supposed to be his fight. It belonged to Damon now, and that was the way it should be. That afternoon, the crew gathered outside the clubhouse. Sarge stood beside his bike, tightening the straps on his bag. Riley crossed her arms. "So, that's it? You're just going to ride off into the sunset?" Sarge smirked. "Not quite a sunset yet." Lynch shook his head. "Damn shame. We could use you." Sarge patted him on the shoulder. "You got Damon. That's all you need." Damon stepped forward. "Where will you go?" Sarge looked at the open road. "Somewhere quiet." Damon nodded. "If you ever need a place to come back to." Sarge grinned. "I know." He climbed onto his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him. One last ride. One last road. He gave Damon a final nod. "Take care of them." Damon nodded back. "You too." And then, without another word, Sarge twisted the throttle and rode away. No goodbyes, no looking back, just the road ahead. That night, Damon stood outside the clubhouse watching the horizon. Riley leaned against the railing beside him. "Think he'll come back?" Damon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe." Riley smirked. "You gonna be okay?" Damon exhaled. "Yeah." The city was his now. And he was ready. Sarge rode until the town was nothing more than a memory in his mirrors. The road ahead was empty, but he wasn't alone. He carried every lesson, every scar, every battle with him. They had shaped him, defined him, but they didn't own him. Not anymore. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. And wherever that road led next, he would face it the only way he knew how. Head on. The highway stretched endlessly under the afternoon sun, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast, open landscape. The roar of a lone motorcycle echoed through the silence, its rider a silhouette against the horizon. Sarge rode with purpose but no destination. The battles were behind him. The war had been fought. And now he was just a man on the road. For the first time in decades, he wasn't chasing a fight. And for the first time, he wasn't running from one either. Back in the city, the clubhouse was alive with new energy. The remnants of the past had been cleared out, and under Damon's leadership, the crew was stronger than ever. The old Hellfangs were gone, replaced with something new, something better. Damon stood in the garage looking at the bikes lined up, their engines still warm from the day's ride. Riley approached, tossing him a beer. "You're quiet," she noted. Damon cracked the bottle open, taking a sip. "Just thinking." "About?" He exhaled. "Him." Riley nodded. "Sarge?" Damon smirked. "Who else?" They both fell silent, watching as the sun dipped lower. The town had changed. Where once fear had ruled, now there was something else. Respect. Damon had made sure of that. He didn't want to rule through fear like the vulture had. He wanted something different, something lasting. But he knew the past was never really gone. There would always be another fight, another challenge. That's just the way of things. And when that time came, he would be ready. The sound of a motorcycle echoed in the distance. Damon turned toward the street, his brow furrowing. A lone rider approached, the dust of the road clinging to his leather jacket. The figure slowed as he neared the clubhouse, pulling into the lot with practiced ease. The crew gathered, watching in silence as the rider killed the engine and removed his helmet. A younger man, scarred, hardened, but familiar. Damon stepped forward, meeting the stranger's gaze. "You looking for something?" The man smirked. "Maybe." He glanced at the clubhouse, then back at Damon. "This? The place they talk about?" Damon folded his arms. "Depends. What do they say?" "That it's different. That it's not like the others." The stranger tilted his head. "That it stands for something." Damon studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, it does." The stranger extended a hand. "Name's Cole." Damon took it. Damon. A moment passed. Then Cole said, "Heard about a guy named Sarge. Said he built something here." Damon smirked. "He did?" Cole glanced around. "Where is he?" Damon exhaled, a slow smile crossing his face. "Gone." Cole nodded. "Think he'd mind if I stuck around?" Damon glanced at Riley, then Lynch. They exchanged knowing looks. Then he turned back to Cole. "Depends." "On what?" Damon's smirk grew. "If you're ready to earn it." Far down the highway, Sarge rode under the stars. He had left behind a world that no longer needed him, but a new one was just beginning. And wherever the road led, he would meet it like he always had, with no fear, with no regrets, and with nothing left to prove. Just the ride, just the road, and the legend he left behind.